Good evening and welcome to The Proof is Out There. For the past decade, American investigative journalist Jeremy Corbell has been at the forefront of UFO reporting. He's leaked several videos and photos of UFOs captured by the military, which have stumped the experts. And this next one might be the weirdest one yet. It's October 2017. We're at a U.S. Joint Operations base somewhere in Iraq. It's a quiet night at this sensitive military installation. A targeting system scans the sky for threats when its forward-looking infrared or FLIR camera captures something no one expected. A jellyfish-like object moves across the sky. There's an organically shaped mass at the top with what looks like tendrils hanging from it. Despite its brisk clip, the object maintains an eerily rigid shape, seemingly undisturbed by the air it flies through. Jeremy Corbell obtained and then released the video to instant headlines. But this is just a clip. He says the Department of Defense is withholding the full-length version, which reveals the true extent of the object's anomalous capabilities.
Every witness that described seeing the full footage describes the object going out over a lake, dropping into the lake for about 17 minutes, and then shooting off at a 45-degree angle.
That's important because those alleged capabilities align with the Pentagon's official investigations into what the government calls UAP, Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena.
One of the observables we had in the Pentagon was transmedium travel, the ability to operate in multiple different domains and environments. And if this thing did indeed go underwater, well, it would certainly flip that bill as being transmedium.
Not only that, but it may represent the return of a little-known type of sighting.
I think people would be really surprised to learn that these type of objects have been reported for decades, and they actually are referred to as jellyfish UFOs.
One of the most famous instances was a 1977 mass sighting over the Soviet city of Petrozavodsk. This photo captures what witnesses described as a huge, glowing jellyfish with a bright red center. And this wasn't the only sighting of its kind back in the 1970s.
I had the personal privilege of speaking to an elderly gentleman who described in Washington, D.C., in the broad daylight, what appeared to be a luminous jellyfish. And he said, on looked almost like a parachute as it was going up, had this multicolored of red and black, and it reminded him of molten lava.
But why are these so-called jellyfish making a sudden return 5 decades later? Have they gravitated from our nation's capital to our nation's military installations? That's the concern.
What's so troubling here is that this is a very significant potential threat to the safety and well-being of the individuals on this military installation. Imagine if these things can fly now over controlled U.S. military airspace completely anonymously and unchallenged.
Let me be clear. UAP are real. Advanced technologies not made by our government or any other government are monitoring sensitive military installations around the globe.
Here on Proof, we've analyzed several other transmedium UFOs, but none of them looked anything like this, right? Look at these appendages. Here and here and here. They seem to come down from this irregularly shaped mass right there in the center. And then at the top, there are these nodules there and there and there. What are they? Antenna? I can't make heads or tails of what it is we're actually seeing here. Maybe our experts can. Since World War I, camo nets have been used to soften the appearance of harsh edges on everything from helmets to entire vehicles. So could this be a drone using that time-tested technique?
You'll see at one point in the video, you can see several people in this area. You know what a body temperature of a person is. And so this is not something that's hotter than 98 degrees. So when it comes to any types of military machinery, anything like that, that run cold or able to fly at a cold temperature, really nothing comes to mind.
So, is this a genuine UFO? Certain intel says otherwise.
I reached out to sources within the Pentagon. They said that this video actually had been explained by analysts. They didn't, unfortunately, tell me what that was, because it's classified.
But don't worry, we have our own analysts on the case, zeroing in on an important clue.
We can see what appears to be a flag very briefly in the video, and this enables us to estimate the wind speed at approximately 10 miles per hour, which is consistent with the motion of the object in question. And so it's possible that this could be a bunch of balloons.
This object does appear to drift with the wind, just like a balloon, except for one key detail.
We never see any change of shape at all. It seems like the object in the video is too rigid to be a cluster of balloons.
And if this craft really dove into the water, then sped away, as Jeremy Corbell has claimed, how could it be balloons? He says it's time to release the rest of this footage.
UFOs is not a matter of belief. It's true. So I ask that our American government please release the last bit of this footage, because it is astonishing.
Our verdict? Unidentified object. This thing defied expectations at every turn. Camouflaged drone? Too cold. Balloons in the wind? Too rigid. But until we see the full video, we can't call this a genuine UFO. Now let's talk about something else that's making waves. Literally. Anyone who watches our show regularly has probably noticed a recent increase in reports of strange sea creatures spotted all around the world. Well, now it looks like even Alabama might have its own Loch Ness Monster. November 16th, 2023. It's an overcast day at the Gulf Shores in Alabama. Gavin Cox is hanging out on an oceanside deck when he suddenly spots something peculiar off in the distance. Hiding behind the waves, a long black object emerges from the ocean. It appears thick and almost serpent-like. As the front end submerges, we briefly see a snake-like tail curving out of the water's surface before the entire figure disappears back into the deep. Take another look as the specimen reveals itself from the water's surface. While Alabama might seem like a strange place to spot a potential sea monster, the surrounding area has some surprising history.
There actually is a pretty long and rich tradition of sea monster accounts in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the oldest accounts dates back to May 13th, 1872. A Captain Hassel of the Norwegian vessel the St. Olaf described seeing a giant serpentine animal about 70 feet in length, brownish in color, with a snake-like head and 4 fin-like protrusions coming out of its back.
According to Captain Hassel's log, this strange animal was observed by the entire crew for a full 10 minutes.
And then fast forward to 1908, the New York Times reported that the steamer Livingstone encountered a giant 200-foot sea serpent while traveling from Frontera, Mexico, and that it was observed by the captain and crew for a number of minutes. 15 crew members submitted sworn affidavits that were verified by local police officers. So we do have many accounts dating back at least a century or more of giant serpentine animals completely unknown to science that have been spotted in the Gulf of Mexico.
Back in 1962, a group of 5 teenagers took a raft out into the waters from Pensacola, Florida. Only one returned. The sole survivor claimed his 4 friends were picked off one by a giant sea creature. He even drew this picture to describe what he saw. So is it possible we have something huge and hungry living in the Gulf? Let's ask our experts. Some have suggested that perhaps what we're really seeing is an oarfish, which are known to grow up to 36 feet long. They've actually been popping up on shore recently.
Oarfish are extremely long-bodied fish that are distributed throughout the globe. They're a pelagic species, meaning they live out in open water in the larger parts of the oceans. There have been oarfish documented in the Gulf of Mexico, but it doesn't seem to be a very dense population of animals. And in fact, a lot of species that grow to very large sizes will start out smaller in inshore areas and then move offshore. So the idea that this is an extremely large oarfish is pretty unlikely.
Oarfish are typically found in extremely deep water, like 600 to 3,000 feet. And the only time they're found on the surface is usually when they're ill or have already passed away.
In fact, some question if what we're looking at is even biological.
The area that we would expect the head to be found at has sort of a weird hook shape to it that doesn't seem normal for any living animal. It looks a little bit weird. It looks a little more slender than the rest of it and doesn't seem to really match up with everything else.
If this isn't an actual life form, then what is it?
This might actually be some sort of inanimate object, perhaps some plank of wood or a tree that's out to sea. Additionally, the fact that it's kind of bobbing up and down with the water shows that it's not really in control of its own buoyancy or direction of movement. And that's something I would expect to see in something like a floating log.
But in this case, our experts disagree.
You get some kind of a neck or a hump that comes out of the water. That to me tells me it's not just a log. This looks like it could be a biological animal. That being said, I'm having a hard time telling what this is, and to me, it seems like it's a bit of a mystery.
Our verdict? We're calling this one unexplained. Without further investigation, our experts aren't certain what this specimen could actually be. So it's still possible the Alabama coast could have its very own sea monster. And of course, we'll be keeping our eyes out for further intel. Is it possible that beings from another planet could already be walking the Earth? Some people think the invasion started long ago. And a recent video sparked a media frenzy when an alien allegedly appeared, of all places, outside a shopping mall. It's January 1st, 2024. At 8:30 p.m., police squad cars swarm an unfolding emergency at Miami's Bayside Marketplace Mall. It's a chaotic scene as an onlooker pulls out his smartphone and records the action from above. Local resident Ryan Landy was watching from a nearby balcony.
We went out onto our balcony because we heard the screaming. Police cars started showing up in droves. People were just screaming and running through the streets, almost getting hit by cars. We couldn't figure out what they were running from. They were running for their lives.
This video, posted on the internet, shows a frenzy of flashing cop cars and figures scrambling in all directions. Then, as it was posted online, the video uses emoji hands to show something that looks truly out of this world. Did you catch it? The quality of the video is very poor. But look again as we slow it down. It appears to be a giant figure, larger than the cars and people surrounding it, and blurry, as if cloaked or camouflaged. And it casts a large shadow, which you can see here.
Watching all of this, we were just really confused and really fascinated. We were just spending the entire time trying to figure out what was going on, and we really couldn't.
According to people online, this footage seems to show a really tall alien-like figure, around 10 feet or so tall. And they thought that that could explain why so many police were called to the mall. The clips took off and were viewed on social media more than 7 million times.
Media outlets from around the globe report on the public's paranoia over monstrous aliens on the loose in Miami.
Some think that the reason we're seeing more of these aliens is not because they're coming from outer space, but because they've been here all along.
It's a new concept involving homegrown entities known as crypto-terrestrials.
A crypto-terrestrial is a civilization that, in theory, has existed alongside humanity for millennia. The idea is that there was some kind of cataclysmic event that wiped most of them off the face of the Earth. And the ones that survived are using advanced technology that helps them stay undetected in areas like the very deep sea or very far underground.
In 2024, 2 Harvard scholars published a scientific paper that claims the sightings of so-called aliens might actually be these survivors of a long-lost Earth-bound race gradually re-emerging.
So some people are wondering if cryptoterrestrials are actually making their way into society more and more.
There are those who believe that the so-called cryptoterrestrials may have influenced the human race over the millennia, as seen through our mythology and folklore. Could ancient accounts of sunken civilizations such as Atlantis or Lemuria actually be describing cryptoterrestrials? And if so, why would those that remain be interested in a Miami shopping mall? Could we be looking at some overgrown human or animal in this footage?
Just based on the human beings that we've seen in this video, it seems like this is maybe 8 to 10 feet tall. I don't see really any arm movements. It almost seems like it's kind of like wobbly and going slow.
So could this be some cryptoterrestrial?
If there were another species living amongst us, you would think we would see some sort of physical remains. We don't see any fossils or markings or anything left behind at all. And if it was truly cryptic, it doesn't make sense for one to be walking around in such a densely populated area as Miami.
But what then was the reason for this massive police response?
What happened at the mall is that there were about 50 kids playing with fireworks. This triggered people calling the cops, and they signaled a citywide 3, which means that all cops in the area had to deploy to this scene to get it under control.
Okay, so the police were there to bust some juveniles. Then what the heck are we looking at in this video? For that answer, we require some forensic video analysis.
They put 2 different versions of the recording with these different perspectives in the same sequence. So I applied video analysis methodology to compare them side by side. And when we flip the one and play them simultaneously, you can see that it's the same events at 2 different quality levels. And we were able to essentially debunk what was represented here.
Seeing the 2 images next to each other, a clearer picture unfolds. The alien was the police.
It's my opinion that this recording has been compressed to a high degree, misrepresenting what was originally occurring on the ground. Whether or not that was done intentionally, I don't know. But with a higher quality version, you can see the distinct characteristics of these 3 individual subjects and not one. And the Miami Police Department confirmed that these were 3 individual officers.
Our verdict? Thanks to our experts' handiwork, we can clearly see that it's actually just 3 officers walking side by side. Whether it was an intended prank or not remains unknown, but the only thing haunting the mall that evening was a rowdy group of teens. And given a choice, I'd rather deal with the giant alien. Trail cameras are everywhere. Believe us, we know. We've seen them capture everything from a woman pretending to eat a deer carcass to a naked guy who may have been tripping on mushrooms walking on all 4s. Did one of these cameras also capture Bigfoot? Take a look. June 29th, 2013. The sun is just starting to come up in Vernon Parish, Louisiana, when a trail camera is triggered by a murder of crows. While these unassuming birds were the focus of the automatic snapshot, it's what's captured in the distance that has people talking. A strange figure looms in the background, lurking near a hunting blind. When we zoom in, we can see that it's upright on 2 legs and is a uniform dark color.
It's really hard to tell what this is, but obviously it's super, super creepy. This figure is pretty big compared to the hunting blind. Some people have said that they can see muscle definition on the figure. The area is also very lush. There are lots of potential food sources from animals to plants, and there's also water. So it's pretty much a great place for a creature that doesn't want to be detected to hang out.
This parish in Louisiana is no stranger to menacing Bigfoot encounters. Back in 1988, 3 teenagers reported seeing a large grayish-brown beast, approximately 7 feet tall, in a friend's backyard near where this photo was taken. According to the report, the boys ran away after the creature roared at them. And there's more. In a previous episode, we covered this video of another purported Bigfoot out of Louisiana called the Honey Island Swamp Monster. It would reportedly attack wildlife in the area and scavenge for scraps in hunting camps. Are all these accounts one type of creature, simply looking for food?
A lot of Bigfoot researchers do think that Sasquatch is a scavenger. Some people believe that what we're seeing in this photo is actually the start of a hunt.
So Bigfoot could be a scavenger, but could it also be a killer? In the late 40s and early 50s, residents of the small cannery town of Port Loch, Alaska, were shaken by a series of unexplained deaths. Townsfolk were found violently torn apart. Many speculated that a Bigfoot was behind these attacks. Did these hunters in Louisiana escape a similar fate? First, could this just be a local animal?
The Louisiana black bear, one of the 16 subspecies of black bear in the United States, does live in this area. They do sometimes stand on their hind legs to get food, but I don't think we're seeing a black bear. You can see that the hips are just much higher up on the body. This doesn't have a long enough torso to be a black bear. And in this photo, the hind legs are way too tall.
What other bipedal creature might this be? Well, we need to consider the most obvious answer.
I definitely think that this is a person. Everything is congruent with what a human being can look like. It's just we're not seeing a good picture of their face.
However, field researcher Cliff Barrickman hasn't just seen the photo, he's gone to the location himself. And he isn't sold on the idea that this is just some average human.
I have been to the location. That hunting blind gave me the opportunity to do size comparisons. Right next to the hunting blind is a depression in the ground that is 6 inches deep. If it was standing in that depression, the smallest estimate for this animal would be 7 feet tall. Now, that is not outside of the human range by any means, but it is pretty big.
Barrickman also reveals another key detail that can't be seen in this particular image.
What you don't see in this photograph is right here, there is a cage that was specifically designed for trapping hogs. That's an easy meal if you're a primate. On top of that, the crows that were in the foreground of the picture were feeding on feed corn that was thrown there to lure the hogs in.
And according to our expert, it's these crows that rule out this picture as a potential hoax.
If you're depending on the crows to set off the trail camera at the right time, that seems like a very unlikely way to hoax anything. I think that it is more likely that what we're seeing here is an accidentally caught Sasquatch in the background of a trail camera photograph that was triggered by crows.
Our verdict? We're calling this one a potential Bigfoot. While we can't confirm 100% since our experts disagree, Cliff Barrickman's on-site investigation definitely gives us pause before we dismiss this as a hoax or misidentification. What do Pakistan, New Mexico, and Colombia have in common? If you're a regular viewer, you know that they're all locations where strange flying objects have been caught on camera by professional pilots. This season, we continue the tradition near Hawaii. August 9th, 2022, the Pacific Ocean. Commercial airline pilot Chris Van Voris is about 90 minutes into a flight from Honolulu to Los Angeles when nearby pilot chatter calls his attention to an anomaly in the sky.
At this point in time, when we started looking outside, we were able to pick up the anomaly that they were talking about.
Through the cockpit window, Chris records a bright orb appearing to the northwest, just below the Big Dipper.
Okay, there it is.
Let's slow it down and take a closer look. The light moves around a bit before quickly disappearing.
Oh, dang it, went away.
Chris continues recording for more than 2 minutes as the light intermittently disappears and reappears.
Yeah, we got it. We were rather awed by it and dismayed at the same time. Nothing was seen on radar. It would move, and then it would go out. Now, sometimes this is indicative of a satellite, and usually we'd see satellites during either sunset or sunrise, and it would be reflecting the sun from their solar arrays. But this wasn't directly after sunset or sunrise.
But this sighting is far from a first for either Chris or his fellow pilots.
I've seen quite a bit up there, and I know quite a few pilots that have seen these orbs or anomalies, maybe up to 50%.
Chris's video appeared in national news coverage on the growing topic of pilot encounters.
This is not unique. There's videos captured like this all the time. Needless to say, it's always a bad combination to have a commercial airline flying in the vicinity of an unknown object. That is an air safety issue.
In fact, pilots overseas are facing similar safety concerns.
There's also reports by pilots in European countries of these strange lights. One sighting wasn't on the pilot's radar, and Air Traffic Control, or ATC, also did not report the incident.
And these sightings can leave a lasting impression.
This has changed my beliefs tremendously. It's opened my mind to the possibilities of everything from interdimensional travel and portals and time travel and extraterrestrials.
One of the more prominent pilot whistleblowers is Ryan Graves, the first active duty U.S. Navy aviator to go public about regular UAP sightings. He testified about his own encounter to Congress in 2023. So did Chris see one too? Our experts review the data. Is this just a case of mistaken identity? We first ask if this ball of light could be natural, like a meteor or fireball.
Fireball is a very fast-moving object. It looks like an object that is leaving some sort of like a small trail. In the video that we see here, we don't see trails.
So perhaps this light is emitting from a man-made craft, like the afterburners found at the rear of a jet. Like Chris, we don't see it.
When a fighter jet is using afterburners, it's the equivalent of just slamming your foot on the gas in a car. And so you wouldn't see afterburners just burning consistently over any length of time because the act of putting your foot on the gas burns a lot of fuel.
Okay, well, this is the middle of the Pacific. Could it be some secret military technology we were never meant to see?
It is in this weird corridor in the Pacific between California and Hawaii that is frequently used by the government for various testing.
In fact, the nearby Pacific Missile Range facility is the largest range of its kind and is known to test advanced technology systems.
So it's not totally out of the question, but normally that's done in a very controlled setting where it wouldn't be visible to the public.
So while possible, the fact that Chris and other commercial pilots were allowed to fly here makes secret tech unlikely. Then could it be a genuine UFO?
I don't see any characteristics that are unusual or anomalous, but at the same time, I can't tell you what this is. So categorically, it's a UFO. And if you add into the mix the eyewitness testimony, maybe this is more unusual than the video gives it credit.
Our verdict, genuine UFO. If you're a commercial pilot or a veteran who wants to report a sighting, Ryan Graves' nonprofit Americans for Safe Aerospace can help. The organization provides a secure system to collect information through its witness program. And while you're at it, you may as well let us know too. The idea of giant menacing spiders has been a popular conceit since the drive-in B movies of the 1950s. But could there be some scientific truth behind a gargantuan arachnid? Take a look. March 23rd, 2024. Vacationing camper Bruno Ross and a group of friends have hiked to the picturesque top of Mestre Álvaro in Brazil. At around 3:30 in the morning, Bruno prepares his camera to snap some late-night pics when he suddenly discovers he's not alone. An enormous spider perches on the outside of Bruno's tent. Its leg span is comparable to the size of Bruno's flashlight, which illuminates the creature as it moves. It appears massive, big enough to make your stomach drop.
Eu peguei a minha lanterna e fez projetar uma sombra de bicho enorme. A sensação era de que bicho bem grande estava prendendo eu dentro da barraca. Parecia uma cena de filme de terror.
Some have compared this to an eight-legged legend from Africa, the reputed giant Congolese spider known as Jellyfish.
The most famous account involving the Jellyfish involves a couple that was motoring through the Belgian Congo in the year 1938, when, according to them, there was a massive spider about 3 feet in diameter crossing the road in front of their vehicle. The local Baka people in the Congo will talk about how these giant spiders will actually set traps for people that are traveling down these trails.
Both the Congo and South America are known to have an abundance of large, predatory arachnids. Just take a look at this tarantula making a meal out of an opossum.
Some of these monstrous spiders are actually capable of eating small animals, like birds, frogs, and even monkeys. If something like a monstrous spider does exist, I think we would expect to find it deep in the African Congo or in South America.
Have you ever wondered why the spiders from our legends and novels are typically depicted as female? Charlotte, Shelob, even the Greek myth of Arachne. Well, it might be because of all of that web spinning, which many cultures equate with the historically women-led skill of weaving. So, whatever sex this is, could it be a giant spider? We first check to make sure that this sinister specimen is real and not some hairy-legged hoax.
This video may have gotten more attention because the shadows make the spider appear bigger than it is, but it's still a big spider. There's nothing to suggest that it isn't real.
So could this spider be related to the stories of giant spiders like the fearsome Jellyfish?
While a spider could be very large, I think it's highly improbable we would ever find one large enough to be similar to what's described as the Congolese spider. There's a lot of physical constraints that control spiders' sizes.
One such constraint is the spider's respiratory system. They take in air through tiny exposed slits on their abdomen. It's fine for small creatures, but the process is too limited to provide enough oxygen for a larger body. The question remains, what are we looking at? And, more importantly, could this big bugger be eyeing human beings as potential prey?
Based on the location and the size of the spider, this one appears to be a Brazilian wandering spider, which gets about 7 inches, so this one might be on the larger size of their scale.
The Brazilian wandering spider eats animals like mice, lizards, and frogs.
It's not really natural for them to try to chase down and hunt larger prey than themselves. Wasting their precious venom on something a lot larger than them that they can't actually consume is not very energy efficient, and they definitely don't want to do it.
Our verdict? This is a Brazilian wandering spider, and a particularly monstrous one at that. And while its bite is easily treatable, if you do see one of these guys, I'd recommend leaving it alone. According to the International Cloud Atlas, there are 10 basic types of clouds and 27 subtypes distinguished by size, color, and shape. All clouds share one common feature. They're up in the sky, not rolling through parking lots. But in this next story, the facts get a little foggy. July 3rd, 2021, San Ramon, California. Scott Brooks and Bear Matosa are driving through a supermarket parking lot at night when they spot something strange floating out of the darkness. They pull out their phones and record this. A strange, puffy object appears to be tumbling across the asphalt. It's about 3 to 4 feet tall and wide, and it has an amorphous, cloud-like shape. The camera pans to discover 2 more of these objects as they slip slowly over the grassy medians and parking spaces, floating without a care in the world.
Can somebody please explain to me what is going on? It's almost like a cloud. It seemed to be like scooting around a little bit more than I don't know, it wasn't windy, but it was also kind of moving like it was. It was just really strange. Should I introduce myself?
The first thought in my mind is we're dead center between multiple military bases. It's sort of the Area 51 of California. So that was something that struck me that I went, maybe this is a radioactive material that's coming from one of the military bases or something like that.
Those concerns might be well-founded.
It's happened before that the US government and military has tested biological weapons without people knowing.
In 1950, clandestine military tests using non-lethal bacteria were conducted on a massive scale.
Clouds containing bacteria were released from ships over Norfolk, Virginia, and on the coast by San Francisco. And in that case, over 800,000 residents were exposed to this bacteria. In fact, no one knew that this had even happened until 1977. The government hid all of these experiments for years.
Another theory? These clouds could be a cutting-edge, space-age substance, aerogels.
Aerogels are effectively a gel-like substance, but the liquid part of the gel has been replaced by gas, which makes them extremely light. Aerogels have been used as an insulating material for space exploration. NASA uses these kinds of materials as an insulator in spacecraft.
Aerogels were first developed in the 1930s, but their importance as a lightweight insulation material for NASA continues today, including on futuristic projects like colonizing Mars. So, did some of this substance blow away from one of the nearby bases, or do we have our heads in the clouds? Let's ask our experts. Is what we're seeing on camera a work of digital art created by a pair of hoaxers?
I applied frame-by-frame visual analysis of the recording. I was confident in being able to detect the authenticity of this as a camera original file. No evidence of trimming or manipulations or CGI or anything like that.
The recording is real, but the question remains, are we looking at clouds?
To even get a cloud, you need to have water vapor, and the wind is able to keep it suspended in the air. This does not look like fog. This looks like something that should not be even considered a meteorological phenomenon.
So what about the eyewitnesses' concern that it's another secret military test of some airborne weapon or gas?
We have these objects interacting with each other. It seems like they're rolling over each other. In reality, a gas would not do that.
And how about the aerogel hypothesis or some other man-made material?
I have here a sample of what's called aerogel. It bears some similarity to the objects we see in the video. However, these would be very large pieces of aerogel, and aerogel is very expensive since it has scientific and space travel applications. Also, aerogel is very transparent, so I don't think that this is a case of aerogel. There are all kinds of new materials we're inventing all the time. This might be some kind of new material that the general public isn't familiar with yet.
We even wondered if this could be a party trick, like this cloud generator. But ultimately, we can only speculate.
Without holding a sample and being able to test it, I don't think we'll ever be able to conclusively solve this mystery.
What is going?
The night air over northern Alabama carried a peculiar weight, a humidity that clung to skin and whispered secrets in the rustling of the pines. In the small town of Tuscumbia, where the roads wound like lazy rivers through the countryside and the stars above seemed to hold more mysteries than anyone cared to ponder, the locals had long murmured about strange lights hovering over the waters of Loch, a man-made reservoir that glimmered silver under the moonlight. It was not the kind of place where travelers lingered. The few who came were usually drawn by curiosity, a desire to escape the predictable rhythms of everyday life, and sometimes by a stubborn need to believe that the world held more than it appeared. Dr. Elaine Porter, an astrophysicist who had grown weary of city life and the ceaseless chatter of research conferences, had arrived in Tuscumbia on a rainy afternoon, her car tires hissing against the slick asphalt as she wound down narrow backroads lined with magnolia trees. She had been drawn by reports of what local newspapers had sensationally dubbed the Jellyfish UFO. a glowing, undulating shape that eyewitnesses claimed drifted across the waters of Loch, pulsing in shades of translucent blue and green, almost bioluminescent in the darkness. Elaine had initially dismissed it as an optical illusion, a mass of algae reflecting lights from distant boats, or perhaps a combination of fog and the fertile imagination of small-town residents. But a series of grainy videos uploaded to obscure forums and social media platforms, coupled with interviews she had conducted over the phone with witnesses who swore they had seen the entity at close range, had convinced her that at least some aspect of the phenomenon demanded serious investigation. She carried her backpack carefully as she navigated the muddy trail that led to the edge of the reservoir, her laptop and camera gear inside, her mind a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As she approached the water, the evening fog rolled in from the treeline, thickening with every step, so that the world shrank to a muted palette of gray and black. From a distance, the reservoir seemed entirely placid, the occasional ripple betraying the presence of fish or some unseen current beneath the surface. Elaine set up her equipment on a slight rise, the tripod wobbling slightly on the soft ground. She calibrated her camera lenses, adjusted the infrared filters, and tapped a small microphone array to record any anomalies in sound frequency that might accompany the visual phenomena. The locals had warned her. "It only comes out when the fog is thick," a man named Carl Wren had said over the phone, his voice rasping, tired from years of farm work. "You'll see it drift like a jellyfish, glowing and floating like it's alive. And it's not really in the water or the air, it's somewhere in between." Elaine had smiled politely during the call, trying not to let disbelief creep into her tone. But now, standing in the mist with only the faint hum of insects and distant frogs for company, she felt a creeping unease. At precisely 10:07 p.m., she noticed the first flicker. A soft, pale blue light emerging from the center of the reservoir. It pulsed slowly, almost rhythmically, expanding and contracting in size, and then it rose, lifting off the surface of the water as if propelled by some invisible current. Elaine's hands shook slightly as she focused the camera, her scientific mind racing to account for every natural explanation. Bioluminescent algae, a boat with malfunctioning navigation lights, a reflection from the moon. Yet none of these seemed adequate. The shape of the light was amorphous, undulating with a motion that suggested intelligence, a deliberate, fluid grace that defied conventional physics. She adjusted her microphone and caught a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath her boots. The sound was not mechanical. It had a depth and richness that suggested some living energy, vibrating in a spectrum humans could only barely perceive. The mist around her thickened, curling in spirals as if drawn toward the glowing entity. Elaine's pulse quickened, and for the first time, she realized that her investigation was no longer a matter of detached observation. She was in the presence of something that might forever change her understanding of life, the universe, and the fragile boundaries between them. As the minutes stretched, more lights appeared. Smaller orbs drifting alongside the primary entity, each pulsating in its own tempo, forming a dance that was both hypnotic and unsettling. Elaine whispered to herself, a reflexive muttering born of awe. "It's not alone, it's never alone." She raised her camera higher, adjusting focus, trying to capture the full complexity of the formation. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the main light collapsed inward, a sudden implosion of brilliance that left the fog thick, opaque, and silent. Elaine blinked, doubting what she had seen, but the recordings on her camera revealed the truth. There was no trick of the eye, no misfiring sensor, only the undeniable presence of something extraordinary. She packed up her gear slowly, mind racing with questions. Who or what were these beings? Why Loch of all places, and why now, after decades of quiet? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of an engine, an old boat chugging through the mist toward her location. A man emerged, tall and gaunt, wearing a weathered raincoat. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he said, voice tight, eyes darting nervously over the water. "Most folks around here don't talk about it much, but I've been keeping watch for years." Elaine nodded, cautious but eager to hear his account. "It's been happening for as long as I can remember," he continued. "Some nights it just drifts quiet, almost shy. Other nights it gets playful, I guess is the word. It seems to know when we're watching." The man introduced himself as Jonas Hale, a retired Navy engineer who had settled near Loch after decades of service. He carried a notebook filled with sketches and notes of sightings, including diagrams of the entity's movement patterns. Elaine was fascinated by the precision and care with which he had documented the phenomenon, realizing that her own scientific training might finally find a collaborative partner in this local observer. Jonas led her to a secluded cove, one he claimed provided the best vantage point. There they waited in near silence, only the occasional croak of a frog breaking the stillness. Hours passed, and just when exhaustion threatened to overtake Elaine's vigilance, the jellyfish-like UFO reappeared, this time accompanied by an array of smaller, bioluminescent shapes that twisted in a synchronized pattern across the water. Elaine raised her camera, heart hammering in her chest as Jonas whispered, "See how it avoids the trees? It's aware of us, of everything around it." And she understood then that the entity was not merely a physical phenomenon, but a conscious presence observing, interacting, existing in a way humanity had not yet learned to comprehend. Over the next several nights, Elaine returned to Loch, recording, measuring, and theorizing. She found that the entity responded to sound frequencies, particularly low hums that matched the resonance of her equipment, almost as if it recognized patterns and reacted to stimuli. Her scientific curiosity grew into something more, a personal obsession, an unshakable belief that whatever this being was, it had chosen her, or at least chosen to reveal itself in ways she could document. Rumors began to circulate in Tuscumbia about the outsider who talked to the lights, but Elaine paid them no mind. Her life had transformed from ordinary researcher to chronicler of the unknown, each night spent at Loch in a chapter in a story that had no clear beginning or end. And yet, as she delved deeper, a shadow of doubt crept in. What was the origin of these beings? Were they visitors from distant worlds, experiments of human technology, lost to time, or a manifestation of something entirely alien to earthly understanding? The lines between science and faith, observation and participation, blurred as Elaine faced the unfathomable intelligence before her, each pulse of light a question she might never answer, each hum a reminder that the universe still held secrets far beyond human reach, and that the truth, however elusive, demanded both courage and surrender. The nights at Loch began to take on a rhythm of their own, a cadence dictated not by the clock but by the pulse of the jellyfish-like lights and the murmur of the fog settling over the water. Elaine's obsession deepened as she noticed subtle changes in the patterns of the entity's appearances. It was no longer a random spectacle, there was intent in the timing, a deliberate choreography that suggested observation, communication, or perhaps something far more inscrutable. Each night, she would arrive before darkness fully descended, setting up her tripods, cameras, and recording devices with meticulous care, while Jonas Hale followed a ritual of his own, jotting notes and cross-referencing past sightings in his dog-eared notebooks. The town of Tuscumbia watched from a cautious distance, whispers spreading like wildfire about the outsider who had somehow gained the attention of the lights. Children claimed to see glowing tendrils hovering in their bedrooms. Fishermen swore the water itself seemed to shimmer with the entity's presence, moving in pulses and waves that defied explanation. One evening, Elaine arrived to find Jonas pacing along the muddy bank, muttering under his breath. "It's changing," he said as she approached, his eyes darting over the mist. "The pattern it's learning. Or it's testing us. I've seen it respond to my movements, but now it's responding before I even act." Elaine frowned, adjusting her camera lenses. "Testing us? Or guiding us?" she asked, the words barely above a whisper. Jonas shook his head. "I don't know anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it's even from here, from this world." The fog thickened around them as they waited, a white curtain smothering the edges of the reservoir, leaving only the reflective glimmer of the water and the occasional croak of distant frogs. Then, as if summoned by their thoughts, the main jellyfish light emerged, larger than ever before, hovering just above the surface. Its tendrils undulated gracefully, refracting in shades of blue, green, and violet, a color palette so complex it seemed almost alive. Smaller orbs flickered around it, forming arcs and spirals that defied the logic of natural motion. Elaine raised her microphone array, adjusting it to capture the low hum that had become the entity's signature sound. This time, however, there was a distinct pattern in the resonance, almost like Morse code, subtle shifts in frequency that repeated in sequences. Elaine's pulse quickened. Could it be a language? Could the entity be trying to communicate? Jonas watched silently, eyes wide in disbelief. It's speaking," he whispered. Elaine leaned forward, translating the frequency variations into visual data on her laptop. There were recurring motifs, slight pulses that correlated with the movements of the smaller orbs. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. "It's not random. It's structured. I don't know what it means yet, but there's intelligence here, beyond any terrestrial animal or human technology." As they observed, the entity shifted direction, drifting toward a narrow inlet of the reservoir. Elaine followed with her camera, noticing the light bending around obstacles, moving with an awareness that suggested more than instinct. She tried to calculate velocity, energy output, and luminosity, yet her instruments barely captured the full spectrum of what she saw. It was as though the entity existed partially outside the range of human perception, revealing only fragments at a time. Jonas murmured, "I've never seen it go this far into the cove. Maybe it wants us to follow." Elaine's mind raced. The idea of pursuing an unknown entity in the fog was terrifying, yet exhilarating. Carefully, she and Jonas moved along the bank, their boots sinking into soft mud, every sound amplified by the mist. As they rounded a bend, the main light appeared directly ahead, hovering above a shallow area of water, casting distorted reflections that shimmered like liquid glass. The smaller orbs circled around it in precise rotations, almost ritualistic. Elaine lifted her microphone closer, capturing the hum as it rose and fell in a cadence that seemed to mimic breathing. And then, in a moment that made her breath catch, the main light expanded and emitted a sudden flare, revealing a subtle shape within, an outline organic and gelatinous, with tendrils that moved independently, almost with purpose. It was alive. Not just alive, but aware, sentient, and observing them as they observed it. Elaine's scientific rationality wavered as awe and fear collided. She could feel a presence in the air, an energy that pressed against her skin and filled her ears with a resonance she could not entirely explain. Jonas whispered, "I think it wants us to touch it, or to understand it." Elaine shook her head, unsure if she should approach. But the entity's tendrils extended slowly toward her, hovering inches above the water, as if inviting her into a communion. She stepped forward cautiously, reaching out, and the moment her fingers neared the misty tendrils, the water itself seemed to ripple in response, sending waves that shimmered with ethereal light across the surface. A vibration passed through her hand, subtle yet undeniable, like the soft pulse of a heartbeat that existed beyond normal senses. Elaine staggered back, overwhelmed yet captivated. Her scientific training battled with the raw emotional response coursing through her. Fear, wonder, curiosity, and an odd sense of intimacy with the unknown. Over the next several nights, they returned repeatedly. Elaine documented every flicker, pulse, and movement, while Jonas hypothesized that the entity had a rhythm that might correspond to lunar cycles, weather patterns, and even subtle electromagnetic fluctuations in the Earth's crust. They experimented with sound frequencies, tapping low hums and modulating tones, observing the entity's reactions. At times it mirrored the sounds, echoing them in waves of color and movement, suggesting comprehension. One night, after an intense session of observation, Elaine awoke in her rented cabin to a faint buzzing in her ears, persistent and insistent. Drawn outside, she followed the sound to the edge of the water, where the fog lay thick and nearly impenetrable. There, in the blackness, a single orb floated silently, hovering at eye level. It pulsed gently, almost as though inviting her to listen. As she leaned in, the hum synchronized with the beating of her heart. Images flashed in her mind, not memories, not dreams, but impressions. Vast oceans under alien skies, cities suspended in the air, beings with translucent bodies and fluid forms, moving in a deliberate, harmonious chaos. Elaine gasped, staggering back. The experience was fleeting, but its impact lingered. A profound sense that reality was far more malleable than human perception allowed. Over time, she began to suspect that the entity's appearances were not simply phenomena to be recorded but lessons, communications in a language humans had not yet evolved to comprehend. She and Jonas mapped every pattern, plotted every movement, and yet the more data they collected, the more elusive the truth became. It was as though Loch was a classroom, and they were unwitting students, learning not with logic alone but with intuition, empathy, and the willingness to surrender to the unknown. One particularly fog-laden night, a group of local teenagers dared to approach the reservoir, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the mist. The jellyfish entity reacted instantly, retracting its tendrils and pulsing violently, casting the entire cove in brilliant, almost searing light. Elaine and Jonas watched from a distance, hearts pounding, realizing that the entity had boundaries, awareness, and perhaps a moral compass of sorts. When the teens fled, terrified, the light slowly dimmed and resumed its undulating dance. Elaine began to see that the entity's presence was both fragile and precise. It existed in a balance that humans could easily disrupt. By the 10th night, Elaine's recordings had amassed terabytes of data. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Sequences of pulses that repeated almost mathematically, rotations of the orbs that corresponded to Fibonacci sequences, and a persistent, underlying rhythm that hinted at consciousness and intention. Her scientific mind was aflame with possibilities. Could it be a species previously unknown to science, existing partially out of phase with human perception? Or was it a form of intelligence entirely alien? One that communicated not through language but through light, sound, and resonance? As the nights wore on, Elaine found herself drawn into a symbiotic relationship with the entity, her presence at Loch becoming a ritual of observation, meditation, and subtle communication. She spoke softly to the lights, sometimes singing, sometimes humming low tones that Jonas had helped her calibrate. And sometimes, just sometimes, the entity responded in ways that seemed almost deliberate. A tendril flickering in time with her hum, or a cluster of orbs spiraling around her in acknowledgement. It became clear that Loch was no ordinary reservoir, no ordinary patch of Alabama wilderness. It was a threshold, a meeting place for the known and unknown, a liminal space where human perception collided with something vast, sentient, and beautiful. Elaine realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer a mere observer of the universe. She had become a participant in a dialogue with a consciousness she could barely comprehend, and the implications of that truth would ripple through every facet of her existence, challenging her notions of reality, science, and what it meant to truly witness the extraordinary. By the time Elaine had reached the 12th night of her vigil at Loch, the atmosphere around the reservoir had become charged with a tangible tension, as though the entity itself anticipated something monumental. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, clinging to the trees and water with an almost tactile weight, muting the familiar sounds of crickets and distant owls while amplifying the low-frequency hum that had become her constant companion. Each step along the muddy shoreline felt like crossing a threshold into a different reality, one where conventional physics bent and perception shifted. Elaine had begun to notice subtle changes not only in the behavior of the jellyfish-like UFO, but also in her own physical and mental state. There was a persistent tingling along her spine, a faint vibration in her skull that seemed to synchronize with the pulsing lights. She attributed some of it to stress, fatigue, and the sheer intensity of the experience, yet she could not deny a creeping sense that the entity was interacting with her on a level far beyond mere observation. Jonas Hale had started to express similar observations, though he was more cautious in framing them. "It's like it knows you're thinking," he said one night, staring into the swirling fog as if expecting the entity to materialize mid-air. "I feel it too, Elaine. When I step too close, when I try to predict its movements, I sense it adjusting almost deliberately. There's awareness there. A presence." Elaine nodded, her eyes glued to the reservoir. "And it's not just us. I think it's aware of everything, the water, the trees, even the air currents. It exists in a state that we can only partially perceive. But it's choosing what to reveal, and we're lucky to witness it at all." That night, the lights appeared with a suddenness that was startling, emerging as a single massive luminescent form that hovered just above the surface, tendrils undulating slowly, each movement deliberate and almost hypnotic. Smaller orbs flickered around it in arcs and spirals, their paths so precise it suggested a geometric understanding far beyond human comprehension. Elaine adjusted her camera lenses and pointed her microphone array at the formation, capturing the hums, pulses, and subtle shifts in frequency. As she did, she noticed something extraordinary. The entity seemed to respond in real time to her equipment, the tendrils flickering and contracting as she altered the pitch and volume of the hums she transmitted. "It's reacting to us," she whispered to Jonas, who nodded solemnly. "Not just reacting, learning," he replied. "I've been tracking this for years. It's adaptive. Every time you or I change a variable, it changes too. It's intelligent. The realization that they were not merely observers but participants in an interspecies, or perhaps interdimensional, interaction weighed heavily on Elaine. Her scientific rigor demanded evidence, repeatability, and control, yet every experiment they conducted only deepened the mystery. Patterns emerged. Sequences in the flickering of the orbs that mirrored Fibonacci spirals, pulses of light that corresponded to electromagnetic fluctuations, and subtle rotations that hinted at a form of communication built on resonance and movement rather than words. Elaine's obsession grew. She spent hours analyzing the footage, attempting to decode the sequences, often waking in the middle of the night with fragments of insight that dissolved upon full consciousness. One night, while reviewing her recordings, she noticed a faint outline embedded within the main light, a structure almost skeletal in appearance, translucent and gelatinous, with tendrils that extended and retracted independently. It was alive in the truest sense, and the movement suggested deliberate thought, anticipation, and perhaps even curiosity. Elaine shared her observations with Jonas, who leaned closer to the screen. "I've never seen anything like it," he murmured. "And I've tracked strange occurrences my whole life, but this is something else entirely. It's more than biology, more than physics. Its existence manifesting in a way we can barely comprehend." Over the next several nights, they experimented with communication. Elaine emitted low-frequency tones, tuned to specific intervals that matched the pulses of the entity. At first, there was minimal response, subtle flickers that might have been coincidence. But gradually, the formation began to mirror her tones with astonishing precision, the tendrils curling and extending in synchrony with each pulse. Jonas documented the reactions meticulously, sketching the geometry of the light sequences, noting repetitions and variations that suggested intentionality. It became increasingly clear. Loch was a stage for dialogue, a meeting ground between human perception and a consciousness entirely alien yet astonishingly coherent. Then came the night that changed everything. The fog was thick, the air heavy, and the hum in the atmosphere nearly tangible. Elaine felt a pull she could not resist, an almost gravitational attraction toward the center of the reservoir where the main entity hovered. Tentatively, she stepped into the shallow water, her boots submerged in cold, silted depths. The entity responded instantly, tendrils extending in arcs that mirrored her movements, pulsing in a pattern that seemed to acknowledge her presence. She reached out, fingertips skimming the misty tendrils, and a vibration surged through her body, a resonance she had never experienced before. Images flashed in her mind. Vast oceans under alien skies, cities suspended in light, beings moving in harmony, communicating through color and vibration rather than sound or language. Elaine staggered back, breathless and disoriented, her scientific mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the experience. Jonas watched in awe, unable to speak, only documenting every flicker and movement. In the days that followed, Elaine noticed subtle changes in herself. Her perception of time altered. Hours could pass in what felt like minutes, or moments could stretch into lifetimes. Sounds she had never noticed before, low-frequency vibrations in the trees, the hum of distant insects, became as distinct as spoken words. She began to intuit patterns in the entity's behavior, sensing shifts in mood, intent, and awareness as clearly as she once recognized a human expression. One evening, as they sat on the bank reviewing footage, Jonas spoke cautiously. "Elaine, I've been thinking, what if it's not just trying to communicate with us? What if it's testing us? Seeing if we're ready for something bigger?" Elaine frowned, considering the possibility. "Bigger? Like what?" Jonas shrugged. "I don't know. But the way it reacts to our presence, the patterns, the awareness, it's deliberate. It's almost as if Loch itself is a threshold, a kind of gate between what we know and what we've yet to comprehend." That night, as the entity emerged once more, Elaine felt an unmistakable sense of anticipation. The fog swirled, the water shimmered, and the main light pulsed with intensity. Smaller orbs flitted around it, moving in precise rotations, spiraling upward into the mist. Elaine raised her microphone, sending a carefully modulated hum into the night, and the entity responded almost immediately, altering the rhythm and pattern of its pulses in a manner that seemed both playful and deliberate. A sense of connection surged through her, a profound recognition that despite the vast chasm of understanding separating human and alien consciousness, there existed a shared moment of awareness. The entity hovered longer than usual, tendrils extending closer to the observers than ever before. Elaine and Jonas exchanged a glance, both sensing the weight of the encounter. It was as if they had been invited into the very essence of the unknown, granted a fleeting glimpse of a reality that defied categorization. In the following days, Elaine's recordings revealed something extraordinary. Subtle changes in the orb's behavior that mirrored human gestures, movements that corresponded to pointing, circling, or directional emphasis, almost as if the entity was attempting to guide them, teach them, or share knowledge through spatial expression. The implications were staggering. Not only were they observing a sentient, otherworldly entity, but they were potentially participating in a form of communication far beyond conventional language. Elaine felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. The more she learned, the more questions emerged, each answer revealing deeper layers of complexity. Jonas, though equally awed, remained cautious. "We need to tread carefully," he warned. "This isn't a game. If it's teaching us, guiding us, we have to respect its intelligence, its space. We could disrupt something beyond our understanding." Elaine nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities. The nights at Loch had transformed her life, reshaping her understanding of consciousness, perception, and the delicate interplay between observer and observed. She had entered a realm where science, intuition, and wonder converged, a liminal space where the universe revealed itself in pulses of light, vibrations of sound, and a presence that transcended the ordinary. And as the jellyfish-like UFO drifted above the water, its tendrils curling in gentle arcs, Elaine knew that this was only the beginning. The threshold had been crossed, the dialogue begun, and the mysteries of Loch were far from exhausted. Somewhere within the undulating glow, a secret waited, patient and intelligent, ready to unveil the next chapter of understanding to those willing to listen, watch, and surrender to the extraordinary. The early weeks of Elaine's research at Loch evolved into a rhythm of anticipation and revelation, a delicate dance between human curiosity and an intelligence that defied classification. Every night brought new subtleties, new nuances in the glowing, undulating forms above the water, and Elaine found herself increasingly unable to distinguish between observation and participation. Her senses sharpened in ways she could barely explain. The faint rustle of reeds in the wind seemed to carry meaning. The low hum vibrating through the mud beneath her feet felt like an extension of the entity's presence, and the fog itself, curling around the reservoir in waves, became a medium for perception rather than obstruction. One night, she arrived earlier than usual, the twilight barely grazing the horizon, and noticed a change in the water's surface. Subtle ripples spread across the reservoir in concentric circles, radiating outward with a symmetry that suggested more than chance. Elaine crouched, her camera poised, as Jonas emerged from the trees behind her, eyes wide and pale in the dim light. "It's starting without us," he whispered, a tremor of awe in his voice. "I've never seen it do that." From the center of Loch, the main jellyfish-like entity rose slowly, tendrils extending in arcs that shimmered with a spectrum of colors that made Elaine's chest tighten with awe. Smaller orbs flitted around it like satellites, forming geometric patterns in midair that mirrored intricate fractals. Elaine realized with a thrill that the entity was performing some kind of ritual, deliberate and precise, as though orchestrating a visual symphony for those attentive enough to witness. The sound that accompanied the lights was equally extraordinary, a low-frequency hum layered with harmonic overtones, modulating in ways that suggested intention and structure. Elaine adjusted her microphone arrays, capturing each subtle frequency shift, and noticed that the changes often mirrored the movements of her own hands and voice. Could it be responding to her gestures? Was it aware of her presence on a deeply perceptual level? As she extended her hand toward the fog, one of the tendrils of light curled around her fingers, a sensation both electrical and organic, vibrating with an energy that left her breathless. She staggered slightly, heart racing, feeling an inexplicable communion with something vast, ancient, and entirely alien. Jonas remained at a cautious distance, notebook in hand, documenting every motion, every pulse of light, yet unable to fully articulate the depth of the experience. "It's teaching us," he said finally, voice barely audible. "Or showing us something. We just don't know the method yet." Elaine nodded, torn between scientific rigor and the raw emotional intensity of the encounter. Over the next several nights, they attempted to formalize their observations into patterns, mapping the interactions between light, sound, and movement. Elaine began to notice correlations that suggested a form of syntax. Certain pulses always preceded a directional change, specific color shifts corresponded to variations in frequency, and the movements of smaller orbs often mirrored the geometry of her own hand gestures. Jonas theorized that the entity's communication was multidimensional, involving not only visible and audible cues but subtle energetic or perceptual signals that humans had no formal language to interpret. Elaine's excitement grew, tempered by a creeping anxiety. If this entity was indeed teaching, guiding, or communicating with them, what was the ultimate purpose? Was it a benign presence, or were they merely subjects of a study beyond their comprehension? The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. One night, during an unusually clear stretch of fog, the main entity performed an extraordinary display. The tendrils extended horizontally across the water, forming arches that refracted the light into dazzling prismatic patterns. The smaller orbs traced elliptical paths around the primary form, creating a three-dimensional lattice that seemed to pulse with a rhythm synchronized to Elaine's own heartbeat. She realized, with a thrill of recognition, that the entity had adapted to her presence. Its movements now responded not only to environmental cues but to the conscious attention of the observers. Jonas recorded everything in stunned silence, occasionally muttering to himself about the mathematical precision of the formations. "It's almost like it's showing us the structure of something," he said. "Not words, not language, but a framework, a model we can perceive if we pay attention." Elaine leaned closer, scanning the visuals, noting the spirals, lattices, and arcs that repeated in precise intervals. The pattern suggested not randomness but order, a logic built into the very fabric of the entity's existence. And yet, as she analyzed, she felt an undercurrent of uncertainty. Understanding might be possible, but comprehension, true comprehension, might remain forever just out of reach. Days bled into nights, and Elaine's life became increasingly intertwined with Loch. The boundary between her personal identity and the entity's presence began to blur. Dreams carried echoes of pulsating lights, low-frequency hums resonated in her waking thoughts, and she found herself thinking in patterns of movement and color rather than conventional language. Jonas noticed the change and expressed concern. "Elaine, you're losing yourself in it," he said one evening, eyes dark with worry. "I don't know if this is healthy. The more we engage, the more it pulls us into its rhythm. You have to be careful." Elaine paused, considering his words, yet felt an irresistible pull back to the water. It was no longer mere fascination. It was an obsession, an imperative. She returned night after night, documenting, interacting, and surrendering to the rhythm of the unknown. One particularly intense night, the entity began a behavior Elaine had never observed before. It projected a series of pulses that radiated outward like concentric waves, each wave carrying subtle color shifts that corresponded to faint harmonic overtones in the hum. Elaine noticed an almost language-like structure, sequences repeated with variation, as if the entity was improvising, teaching, or posing questions. She mirrored the pulses with her own voice and equipment, experimenting with variations, and to her astonishment, the entity responded almost immediately, matching her adjustments in perfect synchrony. Jonas's notes were meticulous, filled with sketches and diagrams attempting to represent the multidimensional communication unfolding before them. Elaine realized that the entity was not merely reacting. It was conversing, initiating a dialogue across dimensions of perception that humans could only partially access. As the weeks progressed, other locals began to take notice. Fishermen reported seeing strange lights dancing above the reservoir long after Elaine and Jonas had left. Children whispered of glowing tendrils brushing against their windows, and rumors began to spread of an otherworldly presence that had claimed Loch as its domain. Elaine welcomed none of this attention, guarding the entity's presence as a secret yet feeling a deep responsibility to document, study, and understand what they had been granted to witness. Her equipment captured terabytes of data, but she knew that the true essence of the encounter could not be reduced to images, frequencies, or diagrams. It was experiential, perceptual, and profoundly transformative. One night, as the fog lay thick and the water reflected faint moonlight, the entity performed its most extraordinary display yet. The tendrils extended across the entire width of the reservoir, weaving complex patterns that refracted light into cascading arcs, while smaller orbs spiraled in synchronized rotations above the main form. Elaine and Jonas observed in awe, realizing that the entity's movements were no longer random or responsive. They were compositional, deliberate, almost musical in nature. Elaine adjusted her microphone array, emitting low-frequency hums in complex sequences, and the entity responded by amplifying its pulses, creating a dynamic, evolving interplay between observer and observed. The experience was immersive, overwhelming, and beautiful. For Elaine, it confirmed the sense that Loch was not merely a reservoir but a threshold, a point of contact between human perception and an intelligence whose methods of existence and communication transcended ordinary experience. And in that moment, standing knee-deep in misted water, witnessing a sentient, luminous presence that responded to thought, gesture, and sound, she understood that the journey she had embarked upon would change not only her understanding of the universe but her own place within it. For the first time, she allowed herself to surrender fully, not merely as a scientist observing a phenomenon but as a participant in a living, conscious dialogue that defied explanation. Loch, with its hidden depths, fog-laden shores, and shimmering entities, had become a crucible of revelation, an intersection of the known and the ineffable, and Elaine knew that the path ahead, however uncertain, would lead deeper into the mysteries of existence, consciousness, and the extraordinary reality that pulsed just beyond the veil of human perception. And somewhere within the undulating lights and resonant hums, she sensed that the entity, vast and intelligent, patient and deliberate, was guiding her toward truths that no one had yet imagined, truths that would reshape not only science but the very understanding of life, connection, and the infinite possibilities of awareness. The nights at Loch had begun to feel almost sentient themselves, the fog curling and twisting as though aware of each human movement, each whispered sound, and each pulse of the glowing entity that hovered above the water. Elaine had developed a routine: arrive at dusk, set up her cameras and microphones, and surrender to the rhythm of the unknown, allowing the entity to dictate the tempo of her perceptions. The relationship between observer and observed had deepened beyond any scientific framework she had known. She was no longer simply documenting a phenomenon, she was entwined in it, physically, emotionally, and intellectually. One evening, after a particularly oppressive heat had settled over the region, Elaine arrived to find the water unusually calm, glass-like, reflecting a sky mottled with purple clouds that seemed almost otherworldly. Jonas Hale was already at the edge of the reservoir, pacing with a notebook in hand, noting subtle changes in air temperature, humidity, and electromagnetic activity, his experience in naval engineering giving him an uncanny ability to detect anomalies invisible to most. Elaine set down her equipment, her eyes scanning the horizon for the first faint signs of luminescence. It appeared with no warning. A subtle flicker, almost imperceptible at first, then growing in intensity as the fog itself seemed to glow from within. The main jellyfish-like form rose from the water, larger than she had ever seen, tendrils curling with a grace that suggested deliberation and intelligence. The smaller orbs flitted around it in complex arcs, forming patterns that shifted in real time, almost like a three-dimensional language, fluid yet structured, mesmerizing yet disorienting. Elaine raised her microphone array, emitting low-frequency hums that she had carefully calibrated over weeks of observation. Almost immediately, the entity responded, pulses of light synchronizing with her sounds, tendrils extending and retracting as if acknowledging her presence. Jonas scribbled furiously, sketching the geometry of the formations and noting the temporal sequence of each pulse, aware that they were witnessing something beyond conventional understanding. Elaine felt a subtle vibration through the ground, a resonance she now recognized as the entity's method of interaction. It was not threatening. Rather, it was a form of tactile communication, a bridge between her perception and an intelligence operating on an entirely different plane. She extended her hands toward the lights, and the tendrils hovered close, shimmering with iridescent colors that shifted in response to her slightest movements. The sensation was otherworldly, partly electrical, partly organic, entirely alive. In that moment, she understood that Loch was not merely a site of observation but a classroom, a crucible in which the boundaries between human and alien perception were being tested and expanded. Days passed and Elaine's obsession grew. She began to experience subtle changes in her cognition. Her thoughts no longer flowed linearly but in spirals and loops, patterns that mirrored the entity's movements. Time felt elastic. Hours could stretch into what seemed like days or collapse into moments. Her dreams were filled with visions of translucent cities suspended in light, beings moving in complex geometric arrays, communicating through pulses and resonance rather than words. Jonas, though fascinated, grew concerned for her well-being. "Elaine," he said one evening as they reviewed footage, "you're changing. I've seen it in your eyes, the way you move, the way you speak. This interaction is altering you, physically and mentally. You need to rest, to step away at times." Elaine nodded but felt an irresistible pull back to the water. Rest felt like retreat, like abandoning a dialogue that she was only beginning to understand. One night, the entity performed a display that left both Elaine and Jonas utterly transfixed. The main light expanded dramatically, tendrils weaving intricate spirals across the water's surface, while the smaller orbs traced paths that suggested advanced knowledge of geometry and movement. As Elaine modulated her hums, the entity responded in real time, a synchrony so precise it suggested not mimicry but comprehension. In a flash of insight, Elaine realized that the lights were not just communicating. They were teaching, demonstrating principles and patterns that hinted at intelligence, consciousness, and perhaps even morality beyond human understanding. The fog thickened as the performance continued, curling around the observers like a living curtain, muffling sound and amplifying the resonance of the entity's hum. Elaine's pulse synchronized almost instinctively with the rhythmic pulses of light, her mind attuned to the flow of information being imparted. She felt as if the entity was offering her a glimpse into a form of cognition so alien, so vast, that conventional language and thought were inadequate to contain it. Jonas, ever the meticulous recorder, captured every detail in diagrams, audio recordings, and notes, yet even he acknowledged that much of the experience could not be quantified. It was perceptual, experiential, and transformative. Weeks into their nightly vigils, Elaine noticed a subtle but profound shift in the entity's behavior. It began to approach the shoreline more closely, tendrils hovering near her hands, reacting almost playfully to gestures, movements, and sound patterns. At times, it seemed to guide her, altering its sequence of pulses and arcs in ways that suggested instruction rather than random activity. Elaine began to suspect that they were being invited into a deeper form of interaction, a stage of the relationship in which observation alone was insufficient, and participation was required. The revelation was exhilarating and terrifying. She knew that every engagement carried risk, the entity's intelligence was far beyond their comprehension, and yet the opportunity to interact directly was a rare and precious gift. One night, she stepped cautiously into the shallow water, following the pulsing tendrils as they extended toward her. The vibrations she felt were immediate and overwhelming, resonating not just through her hands but through her entire body, a complex wave of energy that conveyed not sensation alone but awareness, recognition, and perhaps even approval. Jonas observed from the bank, documenting every moment with meticulous care, yet unable to experience the profound communion Elaine was undergoing. The lights shifted, forming spirals and arcs that seemed to mirror her movements, responding to her hums with subtle modulations of color and intensity. It was a dance of perception, a dialogue conducted in a medium humans had never been taught to read. In the following days, Elaine's equipment revealed new phenomena. Micropulses of light previously undetectable, shifts in the electromagnetic field around the reservoir, and a faint harmonic resonance in the fog itself, suggesting that the entity's influence extended beyond the visible and audible. Jonas hypothesized that Loch had become a nexus, a point where the boundaries between human perception and an alien consciousness overlapped, allowing interaction on multiple sensory planes simultaneously. Elaine's nights became increasingly immersive. She would close her eyes and allow herself to move in time with the pulses, gestures, and vibrations, experiencing a form of understanding that transcended words. Concepts, patterns, and abstract knowledge were conveyed directly, as if the entity had found a way to bridge the gap between cognition and perception, teaching without language, guiding without coercion. The town of Tuscumbia began to whisper more insistently about the mysterious outsider, and the glowing lights at Loch fishermen told of orbs flitting above their boats. Children spoke of shimmering tendrils brushing their windows, and locals avoided the reservoir after dark, fearing something beyond comprehension. Elaine welcomed none of the attention. She had become a custodian of an experience too profound to share recklessly. Her recordings, while meticulous, were only a fragment of what was being conveyed and perceived, a pale echo of the direct communion she and Jonas were privileged to witness. One evening, as a storm approached, the entity's display reached unprecedented complexity. Tendrils extended in sweeping arcs across the water, forming intricate lattices of light that refracted the storm clouds above, while smaller orbs traced synchronized spirals, creating a dynamic, multidimensional structure that seemed almost architectural in nature. Elaine modulated her hums, experimenting with variations and observing how the entity adapted its responses in real time. The dialogue was unmistakable, a two-way interaction in which thought, gesture, and perception intertwined seamlessly. She felt a profound sense of connection, as if the boundary between her consciousness and the entities was dissolving, and she was becoming part of a greater, interwoven pattern of awareness. By the early hours of the morning, the display gradually diminished, tendrils retracting and lights dimming until only faint pulses remained. Elaine and Jonas sat in silence, absorbing the intensity of what they had witnessed, aware that each encounter was unique and irreproducible, a fleeting glimpse into a form of intelligence that defied conventional understanding. Loch, with its fog-laden shores, reflective waters, and sentient lights, had become a crucible of perception, a threshold where human awareness brushed against something vast, ancient, and incomprehensibly intelligent. Elaine understood that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer simply a scientist documenting a phenomenon. She was a participant in a living dialogue, a witness to consciousness in forms beyond the ordinary, and a student of a language composed of light, vibration, and intention. And somewhere within the undulating glow of the entity, she sensed that the next lesson, the next revelation, was already waiting, patient and deliberate, poised to expand not only her understanding of the universe but her own perception of what it meant to be alive and aware in a cosmos that was far richer, stranger, and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. As the night stretched into weeks at Loch, Elaine began to notice a subtle shift in the entity's behavior, one that suggested not only intelligence but a level of intentionality far beyond anything she had anticipated. It was no longer sufficient to merely observe and respond. The entity seemed to be initiating sequences, patterns, and interactions that demanded recognition, interpretation, and participation. Elaine's senses had sharpened to a near-alarmingly acute level. She could feel the fog pressing against her skin, each tendril of mist carrying a vibration, a subtle pulse that mirrored the movements of the luminescent forms on the water. Jonas Hale, though equally astute in his observations, often lagged in perceiving these finer subtleties, and Elaine realized that the dialogue with the entity required more than recording equipment or diagrams. It required immersion, intuition, and an almost meditative attunement to the resonance of the environment. One particularly heavy evening, the fog rolled in like a living wall, swallowing the forest and water alike. The main jellyfish-like entity rose slowly from the reservoir, its tendrils extending and curling with an elegance that defied gravity, each movement punctuated by waves of luminescence that shimmered in shades of deep cerulean, emerald, and violet. The smaller orbs flitted around the primary form, weaving complex geometries that seemed to convey both structure and improvisation simultaneously. Elaine held her microphone array carefully, emitting a sequence of low-frequency hums she had developed over several nights of experimentation. Almost immediately, the entity responded, modulating its pulses and extending tendrils in a manner that mirrored the sequence. It was no mere mimicry. The entity adjusted, expanded, and improvised, suggesting comprehension, awareness, and a form of dialogue that transcended traditional communication. Jonas scribbled feverishly in his notebook, sketching the evolving patterns of light and mapping correlations with the audio pulses. He muttered under his breath, It's teaching us how to see, how to perceive. Not with eyes but with awareness itself." Elaine felt an inexplicable thrill, a profound sense of connection that bordered on spiritual. The fog swirled around them, amplifying the resonance of the entity's hum, and she realized that Loch in itself had become a medium, a liminal space where consciousness, perception, and the unknown intersected. The entity's tendrils extended closer to her, hovering inches from her hands, vibrating in patterns that seemed to anticipate her movements, her thoughts, and even her emotional state. Each contact, each subtle wave of resonance conveyed information that defied verbal articulation. Sequences of thought, abstract concepts, and fragments of knowledge encoded in light, vibration, and spatial geometry. Elaine staggered back, overwhelmed yet exhilarated, sensing that the entity was not only aware of her but deliberately guiding her perception, shaping her understanding, and perhaps preparing her for something beyond the reservoir, beyond human comprehension. Over the next several nights, Elaine and Jonas experimented with increasingly complex forms of interaction. Elaine projected sequences of hums and gestures, testing the entity's ability to adapt, respond, and communicate through layered patterns. The entity not only responded but initiated variations, forming sequences that suggested questions, instructions, or demonstrations of principles previously unknown to human understanding. Elaine felt a profound intellectual thrill. They were engaging in a form of interspecies, perhaps even interdimensional pedagogy. Jonas, cautious as ever, warned her to maintain awareness of human limitations. "We can't assume we understand everything it shows us," he said one fog-laden night, his voice tight with concern. "It's intelligent, yes, but we have no measure for the scale or purpose of its cognition. One misstep, one misinterpretation, and we could lose the window entirely, or worse, provoke consequences we can't foresee." Elaine nodded but felt the irresistible pull of curiosity, the compelling urge to immerse herself fully in the experience. The line between observer and participant had blurred entirely. She was no longer a distant scientist, but a conscious part of the dialogue, moving, gesturing, and modulating sounds in tandem with the entity's pulses. One night, as the mist thickened into an almost tangible curtain around the reservoir, the main entity performed a display that would forever alter Elaine's perception of Loch tendrils extended across the water, weaving intricate spirals and arcs that shimmered with a spectrum of colors previously unseen, forming patterns that mirrored fractals, sacred geometries, and something that suggested intent, intelligence, and deliberate artistry. The smaller orbs traced elliptical and circular paths in perfect synchrony, forming a three-dimensional lattice of light that shifted in rhythm with Elaine's low-frequency hums. As she adjusted pitch, tone, and rhythm, the entity responded instantly, expanding, contracting, and improvising in a manner that suggested understanding and adaptation. Elaine realized, without bordering on fear, that the entity was testing them, perhaps teaching, perhaps inviting deeper participation. The experience was immersive, overwhelming, and utterly transformative. She could feel her own consciousness expanding, her perception of time, space, and causality bending to the rhythms of the luminous forms. Jonas documented the sequences meticulously, yet he too acknowledged that their records could capture only a fraction of the dialogue unfolding before them. In the days that followed, Elaine began to experience subtle, but profound shifts in cognition. Dreams became vivid simulations of complex light patterns, abstract mathematics, and sequences of sound and vibration. Even waking moments carried echoes of the entity's influence. Low hums in the trees, shimmering reflections on the water, and a heightened awareness of spatial relationships that suggested a new mode of perception. One particularly transformative night, Elaine felt compelled to step into the water, allowing tendrils of light to brush her arms, shoulders, and face. The vibrations transmitted a rich stream of information, a blend of spatial awareness, harmonic resonance, and abstract understanding that defied language. She staggered back, exhilarated and disoriented, sensing that she had glimpsed a form of consciousness operating entirely beyond human parameters, yet accessible through intuition, attention, and presence. The entity's movements became increasingly deliberate, extending patterns toward Jonas and Elaine in ways that suggested guidance and inclusion, rather than mere spectacle. It was as if Loch itself, mediated by the entity, had become a classroom, a space for teaching and shared perception that transcended conventional understanding. Elaine and Jonas began to theorize that the entity's intelligence was both non-human and non-terrestrial in character, a form of awareness that leveraged light, sound, and spatial geometry as a medium of communication and interaction. The implications were staggering. The reservoir, the fog, the luminous forms, and even the observers themselves were part of a dynamic system, a network of consciousness operating on multiple levels simultaneously. In the weeks that followed, the entity introduced new patterns, increasingly complex sequences of tendrils, pulses, and orbital orbs. Elaine attempted to mimic, anticipate, and respond, and to her astonishment, the entity adapted instantaneously, suggesting a form of reciprocal cognition, a shared awareness between observer and observed that had no precedent in human experience. Jonas's records grew more elaborate, filled with geometric sketches, frequency mappings, and detailed notations of temporal sequences. Yet even he admitted that these represented only a fraction of the phenomenon. The true experience existed in perception, interaction, and presence, elements that could not be reduced to diagrams or sound waves. By the end of one particularly intense night, as dawn approached and the fog began to dissipate, Elaine and Jonas sat on the muddy shoreline in silence, overwhelmed by the depth and breadth of what they had witnessed. The entity hovered above the water, its tendrils gradually retracting, smaller orbs orbiting the primary form in gentle arcs, the final pulses of light fading like the last notes of a symphony. Elaine understood, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that Loch had become a threshold, a conduit between human perception and a consciousness entirely alien yet remarkably coherent. She knew that the nights to come would hold further revelations, deeper levels of interaction, and perhaps the unveiling of knowledge, perception, and awareness that humans had never before encountered. And somewhere within the undulating glow of the entity, she sensed the patient intelligence of a being that had chosen to reveal itself to them, teaching, guiding, and challenging in ways that defied all expectation and promised to forever alter their understanding of reality, consciousness, and the infinite possibilities of existence. By the 7th week of nightly vigils, Loch had become a place of ritual and revelation for Elaine and Jonas. The air carried a different weight now. Even before the fog settled, they could sense the presence of the entity in the subtle vibrations that threaded through the trees, the reeds, and the water's surface. Each step toward the reservoir felt like crossing into a dimension that obeyed different rules, where perception expanded beyond ordinary limits, and the boundary between observer and observed dissolved. Elaine had begun to develop a kinesthetic intuition for the entity's movements, sensing shifts in its pulses and the trajectories of its smaller orbs almost before they occurred. Jonas, always methodical, noted her reactions with a mixture of awe and concern, acknowledging that she seemed to interface with the intelligence in a way he could not, experiencing a resonance that defied measurement. One night, as twilight bled into darkness and the fog rose like a living tide, the main jellyfish-like entity emerged with unprecedented intensity. Its tendrils extended across the water's surface, weaving arcs and spirals in complex geometries that shimmered with iridescent hues. Smaller orbs circled in coordinated patterns, tracing elaborate ellipses, helixes, and fractals, moving with both precision and improvisational fluidity. Elaine raised her microphone array, emitting a carefully calibrated sequence of low-frequency hums. The entity responded immediately, tendrils shifting in synchrony, smaller orbs adjusting their orbits with stunning accuracy. She felt a thrill of recognition. This was no mere mimicry, no random response. The entity was engaging in a structured, reciprocal dialogue, a sophisticated exchange of perception and intention. Jonas observed, noting the correlation between the patterns of light and sound with meticulous care. Yet even his exhaustive recordings could not capture the qualitative depth of the experience. Elaine felt it in her body, her mind, her very consciousness. An invitation to participate, to perceive, to learn through resonance rather than words. Over the next nights, this pattern continued, and Elaine began to detect a rhythm underlying the entity's sequences. A temporal structure akin to language, yet built entirely from light, pulse, and motion. She tried to map it in real time, adjusting her hums and gestures to mirror or complement the sequences. The entity responded with subtle variations, suggesting understanding, adaptation, and perhaps even intentional teaching. Jonas grew increasingly concerned. "Elaine," he said one evening, "you're engaging at a level I can't track. You're almost part of it. You need to maintain some distance. We don't understand the consequences of full immersion." Elaine nodded, yet found herself irresistibly drawn forward, compelled by a curiosity and resonance that exceeded fear. She stepped into the shallow water, allowing tendrils of light to brush against her skin. The sensation was at once electrical, organic, and perceptual, vibrating not just through her body but through her consciousness. In that moment, the entity communicated something profound. Not a concept in words, not a literal instruction, but an experiential understanding of interconnection, pattern, and awareness. She staggered back, heart racing, overwhelmed yet exhilarated. In the following days, she began to perceive subtle interactions between the entity and the environment. The fog itself pulsed faintly with harmonic vibrations, and the water reflected patterns that seemed deliberately aligned with the luminescent forms above. Birds and insects moved differently around the reservoir, reacting in ways that suggested a heightened sense of awareness. Elaine theorized that the entity's intelligence extended beyond its own form, subtly influencing the environment to facilitate interaction and communication. Jonas meticulously recorded these phenomena, recognizing that their observations suggested a multi-layered system of consciousness, where the entity and its surroundings formed a network of interdependent perception. One night, Elaine experimented with sequences more complex than ever before, modulating both sound and movement to produce cascading patterns of pulses. The entity responded in kind, creating intricate spirals and geometric lattices that hovered above the water. Smaller orbs moved in synchronized arcs that formed recognizable shapes when projected onto the fog. A triangle, a spiral, a series of concentric circles. Elaine realized with a thrill bordering on fear that the entity was capable of abstraction, capable of representing ideas visually, spatially, and temporally. Jonas was visibly awed. "I've never seen cognition expressed this way," he said, voice tight with wonder. "This isn't behavior. This is thought, communicated directly through a medium beyond our language." Elaine nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate deep within her. Her nights at Loch had evolved into an immersive dialogue with an intelligence that exceeded human comprehension, teaching not through words but through resonance, form, and perception. Days passed in a haze of anticipation and analysis. Elaine began to notice that the entity was introducing sequences of increasing complexity, as though guiding her toward a new level of understanding. She experimented with more intricate patterns, her movements and hums mirroring the entity's spirals, arcs, and pulses. Each interaction felt like a test, a challenge, and an invitation simultaneously. The entity's responses became more deliberate, its tendrils curling in arcs that seemed to extend toward her cognition itself, vibrating with information she could not yet fully decode. The local town remained largely unaware of the depth of what was unfolding at Loch, though whispers persisted. Fishermen told tales of lights that danced above the water in impossible patterns. Children spoke of glowing tendrils brushing against their windows, and parents cautioned them to stay away from the reservoir at night. Elaine kept the phenomenon largely to herself, feeling the responsibility of custodianship. The entity was patient, deliberate, and intelligent, and she understood that exposing it recklessly could jeopardize the fragile equilibrium of their interactions. One evening during an unusually dense fog, the entity performed a display that left both Elaine and Jonas stunned. The main form expanded dramatically, tendrils weaving in complex spirals that radiated outward across the reservoir. Smaller orbs traced synchronized paths, creating a lattice of light that seemed almost architectural, shifting and folding in ways that challenged human perception of space. Elaine responded with an elaborate sequence of hums and gestures, and the entity mirrored her movements almost instantaneously, improvising variations that suggested comprehension and intent. The dialogue was undeniable, a two-way interaction conducted through light, vibration, and motion rather than language. Elaine felt an overwhelming sense of connection, as if her consciousness had become partially entangled with the entities, allowing her to perceive principles and patterns far beyond ordinary human awareness. Over the subsequent nights, she began to perceive faint micropulses of light previously undetectable, subtle variations in electromagnetic fields, and harmonic resonances that seemed embedded in the fog itself. The entity's intelligence was multi-layered, extending into the environment and interacting with the observers in a sophisticated network of perception. Elaine and Jonas theorized that Loch functioned as a nexus, a liminal space where human cognition could interface with alien intelligence, facilitated by light, vibration, and environmental modulation. The entity's actions suggested intentionality, pedagogy, and perhaps moral consideration. By the end of one particularly immersive night, as dawn's first light broke through the mist, the entity gradually withdrew, tendrils retracting, smaller orbs spiraling downward, leaving only faint pulses that echoed in Elaine's mind. She understood, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, that they were participating in a dialogue of perception and cognition, one that had no precedent in human experience and that would fundamentally alter their understanding of consciousness, awareness, and the limits of perception. Loch had become a crucible of understanding, a threshold where human and alien intelligence intersected, and Elaine knew that the next phases of interaction would demand even greater attention, intuition, and openness. Somewhere within the undulating glow of the entity, within the luminous pulses and vibrating tendrils, lay deeper truths and lessons, waiting patiently for her and Jonas to perceive, understand, and integrate them into a new conception of reality, consciousness, and the extraordinary possibilities of existence. And Elaine, immersed in the glow, vibrating in rhythm with the lights, understood that her journey had only just begun, that Loch was a portal not only into the mysteries of alien intelligence, but into the untapped potential of human perception itself, a space where learning, wonder, and transformation intertwined in ways that defied words, reason, and conventional science. By the 8th week, the nights at Loch had settled into a rhythm that blurred the line between reality and something far more expansive. Elaine awoke each day feeling as though she had traversed not just time but dimensions, her dreams heavy with luminous patterns, harmonic pulses, and sequences that defied conventional logic. Even during daylight hours, fragments of perception lingered. The shimmer of leaves in the wind suggested geometry, the ripple of water mirrored fractal repetition, and faint vibrations in the air seemed aligned with rhythm she could barely detect consciously. Jonas Hale, though less intuitively attuned, chronicled these changes with increasing urgency. He noted minute shifts in atmospheric electromagnetic fields, subtle disturbances in the reservoir's surface tension, and the apparent coordination of wildlife around the water. "It's not just the entity," he remarked one fog-laden evening, scanning the horizon with a handheld spectrometer. "Everything here is part of its network. It's aware of the environment in a way that integrates with our observations. It's teaching us to perceive the system, not just the form." Elaine nodded, sensing the truth of his words. Yet the depth of understanding she experienced went far beyond his scientific recordings. On that particular night, the fog pressed thick against the trees and shoreline, rolling like a liquid curtain that absorbed sound and reflected light with a faint iridescence. The main jellyfish-like entity rose from the reservoir in a slow, deliberate ascent, tendrils extending in arcs that shimmered with colors beyond human naming. Teals, violets, and spectral greens that seemed to pulse with consciousness itself. The smaller orbs danced around the primary form, tracing elliptical paths, intersecting spirals, and complex lattices that flickered like a multidimensional code. Elaine raised her microphone array and emitted a carefully modulated sequence of low-frequency hums, designed to interact with the entity's patterns without overwhelming them. The entity responded almost instantaneously, tendrils extending closer to her body in a gesture that was neither threatening nor casual, but precise, deliberate, and intelligent. Jonas watched with a mix of awe and apprehension. "It's adjusting to your input in real time," he murmured. "This isn't mimicry. It's adaptation, learning, or perhaps teaching. I've never seen anything remotely like it." Elaine felt a thrill that bordered on spiritual. Every pulse, every arc of light, every oscillation in the fog seemed layered with information, instruction, and perception. She reached out her hands, letting tendrils brush against her skin, and felt waves of vibration that conveyed abstract patterns, sequences, and even hints of concepts beyond ordinary understanding. She staggered slightly, overwhelmed yet exhilarated, as the entity pulsed with increasing complexity, almost as if inviting her to follow a path of perception and comprehension that humans had never experienced before. Over the following nights, Elaine experimented with interaction at progressively deeper levels. She projected sequences of hums, gestures, and movement designed to mirror or complement the entity's patterns. Each adjustment produced immediate feedback, subtle or profound, suggesting a reciprocal exchange of awareness, rather than mere reactive behavior. Jonas documented these sequences meticulously, noting the correlation between pulse frequency, color spectrum, tendril movement, and orbital patterns. "I think it's demonstrating abstraction," he said one evening, breathless from hours of observation. "We're not just seeing behavior. We're seeing thought, structure, and perhaps even the framework for a system of knowledge entirely alien yet logical in its own way." Elaine felt a surge of exhilaration. The nights had evolved into more than observation. They were interactive dialogues, experiences of perception that were teaching, challenging, and expanding her consciousness. She began to perceive subtle cues in the fog itself, changes in density, color, and movement that mirrored the entity's pulses, creating a multidimensional sensory network. Her dreams were no longer fragmented. They carried continuity, sequences, and lessons encoded in pulses of light, vibration, and spatial awareness. Even her waking cognition had shifted. Time felt elastic, perception multi-layered, and understanding intuitive rather than analytical. One night, the entity initiated a display that was unprecedented. The tendrils extended across the reservoir, forming arches and spirals that interacted with their reflections in the water to create three-dimensional lattices, fractals, and geometric forms that seemed alive, evolving, and infinitely complex. The smaller orbs traced intricate trajectories around the primary form, orbiting and spiraling in perfect synchrony, creating the sense of a living architecture of light. Elaine responded with her most complex sequence of hums and gestures, yet integrating multiple frequencies, spatial movements, and timing patterns simultaneously. The entity adapted instantly, producing variations that suggested understanding, improvisation, and perhaps even anticipation of her actions. Jonas, almost speechless, sketched the formations rapidly, annotating changes in frequency, pulse timing, and orbital trajectories. Yet even he recognized that the diagrams and recordings could not capture the qualitative experience of engagement, the immersive and transformative resonance of being in dialogue with an intelligence so advanced and subtle that it reshaped perception itself. In the following nights, the entity continued to demonstrate an increasing awareness of human consciousness. It appeared to test, challenge, and expand the limits of Elaine's perception. She noticed micropatterns within the larger sequences, subtle oscillations in light and movement that mirrored her gestures, modulations that corresponded to her vocal hums, and variations in pulse timing that suggested both recognition and guidance. Jonas observed that the local environment also responded. The wind shifted with precise timing, water ripples aligned with orbital paths, and even nocturnal animals appeared to move with unexpected coordination, suggesting the influence of a vast, intelligent system that encompassed Loch entirely. Elaine began to perceive these interactions as a form of learning, a method by which the entity was teaching them to read, interpret, and participate in a perceptual language built from light, motion, and vibration. Each interaction carried layers of complexity, from simple correspondence to advanced, multidimensional abstraction. By the middle of the 8th week, Elaine felt her cognition expanding beyond human norms. She could anticipate tendril movements, predict pulse sequences, and interpret visual and vibrational cues with a precision that astonished even Jonas. Her consciousness felt partially entwined with the entity's rhythm, a shared perception that allowed her to experience a form of understanding inaccessible through conventional senses. One night, she stepped fully into the water, letting tendrils brush her arms and shoulders, feeling waves of vibration that communicated abstract structures, harmonic relationships, and spatial sequences. She staggered back, overwhelmed yet exhilarated, realizing she had glimpsed a form of intelligence that was simultaneously alien and astonishingly coherent. Jonas noted in his journal, "Elaine's participation has reached a level that surpasses observation. She is interacting with consciousness itself, experiencing abstraction, pattern recognition, and temporal modulation at a scale I cannot fully quantify." Loch has become a crucible, a liminal space where the human mind interfaces directly with the non-human intelligence. The following nights continued in this pattern. Elaine and Jonas experimented with more complex sequences, while the entity responded with adaptations, improvisations, and tests of comprehension. Each session deepened their understanding of perception, resonance, and cognition. The fog, the water, and the wildlife all seemed to participate, forming a living network in which consciousness, attention, and intention were integrated across multiple layers. By the end of the 8th week, Elaine understood a profound truth. Loch was not merely a site of observation, not merely a reservoir for luminous forms, but a portal into a system of intelligence, awareness, and perception entirely alien yet astonishingly coherent. Every pulse, tendril, and orbital pattern was a lesson, an invitation, and a challenge. And somewhere within the glowing lattice of light, vibration, and geometry, lay knowledge that could transform understanding of consciousness, perception, and existence itself. Elaine knew that the journey was only beginning. The entity, patient and deliberate, awaited their readiness to perceive the next layers of interaction, to participate more fully in the dialogue, and to confront truths that stretched beyond the boundaries of human comprehension, offering a glimpse of a universe more complex, strange, and beautiful than she had ever imagined. By the 9th week at Loch, the nights had grown dense with anticipation, the air thick with fog and charged with a resonance that seemed almost tangible. Elaine felt as though the entire reservoir pulsed with awareness, each ripple on the water's surface, each whisper of wind through the reeds, and each subtle shift in the fog carrying a message meant only for those attuned enough to perceive it. Her dreams had begun to merge seamlessly with waking consciousness. In both states, luminous forms, geometric lattices, and harmonic sequences wove themselves into her perception, challenging conventional notions of time, space, and causality. Jonas Hale, meticulous and wary, recorded every detail, yet he admitted to Elaine in quiet moments that the depth of what they were experiencing eluded full comprehension. "I can map the pulses, measure the frequencies, sketch the orbits," he said one evening. "But none of that captures the essence. There's a logic here that is living, intelligent, and multidimensional. We are not just observing. We are participants in a consciousness that has its own architecture." Elaine nodded, understanding fully. The entity was no longer simply performing or responding. It was communicating, guiding, testing, and expanding their perceptual abilities. That evening, the fog pressed heavy, a white veil that swallowed the shoreline, muted distant sounds, and reflected the slightest flickers of light with an almost sentient glow. The main jellyfish-like form rose from the reservoir with an elegance that left Elaine breathless. Its tendrils unfurled in arcs and spirals, each movement deliberate, shimmering in colors that seemed to vibrate with consciousness itself. Smaller orbs flitted in elliptical paths around the primary form, tracing complex patterns that intersected, diverged, and recombined in ways that suggested not only intelligence but artistry. Elaine adjusted her microphone array and emitted a sequence of hums she had refined over weeks, designed to interact with the entity's patterns without overwhelming them. Immediately, the luminous tendrils shifted, responding with an improvisation that mirrored her gestures yet added new variations, demonstrating awareness, adaptability, and a form of pedagogical intention. Jonas's notes filled rapidly with sketches, annotations, and frequency mappings, yet even he knew that these represented only a fraction of the unfolding interaction. Elaine stepped cautiously into the water, allowing tendrils to brush against her hands and arms. The vibrations were multidimensional, carrying information that was perceptual, emotional, and abstract simultaneously. She staggered slightly, overwhelmed by the depth of comprehension being imparted, and realized that this intelligence was teaching not through words but through a form of cognition that transcended human language. Over the following nights, Elaine and Jonas began to test the boundaries of interaction. Elaine projected increasingly complex sequences of hums, gestures, and motion, aiming to match or complement the entity's patterns. The entity responded instantly, modulating tendrils, adjusting the orbital paths of smaller orbs, and introducing subtle innovations, suggesting both recognition and challenge. Jonas observed that the surrounding environment also appeared to participate. Ripples in the water synchronized with pulses, fog currents mirrored the movements of tendrils, and nocturnal animals seemed to adjust their behavior in response to the luminous displays. It was as though Loch in itself had become an integrated network of perception, with human, alien, and environmental elements operating in harmony. One night, the entity initiated a display of unprecedented complexity. Its tendrils extended across the reservoir, forming spirals, lattices, and arches that intersected to create three-dimensional geometric structures. Smaller orbs traced synchronized ellipses and helical patterns, generating the impression of a living, evolving architecture of light. Elaine responded with her most intricate sequence yet, combining simultaneous hums at multiple frequencies, spatial gestures, and precise timing. The entity adapted immediately, expanding and modifying its own sequence, creating a dialogue that was tactile, visual, auditory, and cognitive all at once. Elaine felt a profound connection, as if her consciousness had partially merged with the entity's rhythm, allowing perception of principles and structures beyond human cognition. Jonas muttered in awe. It's teaching you perception itself, not just a phenomenon. We are witnessing thought made manifest in light and movement. In the subsequent nights, Elaine began noticing subtle, nested patterns within the entity's displays. Micropulses of light, previously undetectable, aligned with changes in fog density, shifts in water vibration, and even the movements of nearby wildlife. The entity's intelligence appeared to permeate the reservoir, orchestrating a system in which every element, living and inanimate, played a role. Elaine theorized that this was intentional pedagogy. The entity was demonstrating not merely sequences, but the interdependence of all elements in a system of consciousness, perception, and resonance. The complexity of each night's interaction grew exponentially. Elaine began to perceive sequences within sequences, recursive spirals and lattices that suggested layers of meaning, abstraction, and perhaps even moral or structural principles. Jonas, while chronically measuring and recording, increasingly deferred to Elaine's perception, acknowledging that her intuitive understanding of the entity far exceeded what could be captured in graphs, sketches, or frequency analyses. One night, she stepped fully into the reservoir, tendrils brushing along her arms, shoulders, and face. Waves of vibration conveyed abstract forms, relationships, and instructions, a language that could not be spoken but could be experienced. She staggered back, overwhelmed by both the sensory richness and the cognitive implications. She was witnessing intelligence in its purest form, expressed directly through geometry, vibration, and spatial-temporal sequencing. In the following days, the entity introduced new levels of abstraction. Tendrils extended into nested fractals, smaller orbs traced intricate helical paths that overlapped and diverged in sequences that suggested recursion and hierarchy. Elaine experimented with mirroring these patterns, improvising variations to see if the entity would respond to novelty. It did, expanding and adjusting the sequences, demonstrating flexibility, comprehension, and intentionality. Jonas's notes became a tapestry of sketches, numerical sequences, and annotations, but both acknowledged that these were representations of the phenomenon, not the phenomenon itself. Elaine felt herself being drawn deeper into the entity's rhythm. Nights became immersive experiences in which perception, cognition, and physical presence intertwined. She could anticipate tendril movements, detect micropulses of light, and sense harmonic vibrations in the fog and water, all forming a coherent, multi-layered language of interaction. One evening, the entity produced a display that seemed almost sentient in its deliberation. Tendrils created intersecting arches, spirals, and lattices that reflected and refracted against the fog, water, and smaller orbs. The sequences appeared structured yet improvisational, as though conveying a message or guiding Elaine and Jonas toward understanding a principle beyond conventional comprehension. She stepped into the water, allowing tendrils to brush her arms and shoulders, feeling waves of vibration that carried layers of information, spatial, temporal, abstract, and emotional. She staggered, exhilarated, and aware that Loch had become a portal, a threshold where human consciousness could interface with a non-human intelligence through perception, attention, and resonance. Jonas documented the display with meticulous precision, noting each pulse, movement, and color shift, but both knew that the true essence of the interaction existed beyond measurable data, in the experience of engagement itself. By the end of the 9th week, Elaine understood with certainty that Loch was not just a reservoir, not just a location for observation, but a living system of intelligence, awareness, and pedagogy. Each pulse, each tendril, each orbital path was both lesson and invitation, challenging them to perceive, interpret, and participate in a cognitive framework that defied human limitations. And somewhere within the luminous lattice of light, vibration, and geometry, lay truths and insights that could forever transform their understanding of consciousness, reality, and the extraordinary potential of perception when human and alien intelligence intersected in deliberate, patient dialogue. By the 10th week, Elaine felt as though Loch had become an extension of her own consciousness. Each night, she approached the reservoir with a sense of reverence, knowing that she was entering a space where perception, cognition, and reality itself bent under rules not her own. The fog, thick and luminous, pressed against her like a living entity, vibrating with harmonic frequencies that resonated deep within her chest. Jonas Hale, ever the careful observer, recorded every detail with an intensity that bordered on obsession, yet he often admitted, voice low with awe, that his notes could not capture the full depth of what they were witnessing. "We can chart the sequences, measure the pulses, map the orbits," he said one night. "But the essence, the understanding, the intuition, the dialogue, is inaccessible through conventional recording. We are participants in a living language." Elaine nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate in every fiber of her being. The main jellyfish-like entity rose from the water with a grace that defied gravity, tendrils unfurling in elaborate spirals and arcs, shimmering with colors she could not name. Smaller orbs moved in synchronized paths around it, weaving elliptical and helical patterns that intersected and recombined in ways that suggested a multidimensional logic, deliberate and intelligible, only through perception rather than thought. Elaine raised her microphone array, emitting a sequence of low-frequency hums she had calibrated over weeks to interact with the entity without overwhelming it. Immediately, tendrils extended and contracted in response, smaller orbs altered their trajectories, and pulses of light intensified in what felt like an acknowledgement, a conversation, a challenge, and an invitation simultaneously. She stepped cautiously into the water, tendrils brushing against her arms, her shoulders, and the back of her neck. Vibrations coursed through her body, carrying abstract structures, spatial sequences, and what she could only describe as cognitive instructions. She staggered, overwhelmed, exhilarated, and profoundly aware that she was engaging directly with a form of intelligence, utterly alien yet astonishingly coherent. Over the following nights, Elaine experimented with increasingly complex sequences. She projected layered hums, precise gestures, and intricate movements, designed to mirror, complement, or challenge the entity's patterns. The entity responded immediately, adapting sequences, introducing new elements, and improvising variations that suggested comprehension, recognition, and an intent to teach. Jonas meticulously chronicled these developments, annotating tendril positions, pulse frequencies, orbital paths, and emergent patterns. Yet even he admitted that the true essence of the dialogue existed in perception and engagement, rather than in charts or recordings. The environment itself seemed to participate. The fog shifted subtly, echoing the luminescent patterns, water ripples synchronized with tendril arcs, and nocturnal wildlife moved in response to the entity's pulses, creating a living network of awareness in which human and alien cognition interwove seamlessly. One night, the entity initiated a display of unprecedented complexity. Tendrils extended across the water, forming spirals, arches, and lattices that intersected to create three-dimensional structures, reflected and refracted in the fog. Smaller orbs traced elliptical, helical, and circular paths, generating a dynamic architecture of light that seemed both aesthetic and instructive. Elaine responded with her most intricate sequence yet, combining multiple hum frequencies, simultaneous gestures, and precise timing. The entity adapted instantaneously, producing variations that demonstrated not just comprehension but innovation, improvisation, and anticipation. She felt an overwhelming sense of connection, as though her consciousness had partially merged with the entity's rhythm, enabling her to perceive structures, sequences, and patterns that humans had never before conceived. Jonas murmured, breathless, "Elaine, it's teaching you perception itself, not merely behavior. We are witnessing thought made manifest in geometry, vibration, and spatial-temporal sequences." In the subsequent nights, Elaine noticed nested patterns within the entity's displays. Micropulses within larger sequences, subtle oscillations in light intensity, and recursive movements of smaller orbs. These patterns suggested layered meaning, abstraction, and perhaps principles of ethics or structure that transcended ordinary human cognition. Elaine experimented by mirroring, inverting, and improvising upon these sequences, observing the entity's responses. Each adaptation by the entity seemed intentional, challenging her perception and pushing her toward a deeper comprehension of structure, rhythm, and awareness. The integration of the environment deepened. She perceived harmonic vibrations in the fog and water, subtle changes in temperature, and even the movements of birds and insects as part of the overall system. The entity appeared to orchestrate a network in which all elements of Loch, the water, the fog, the creatures, and the human participants, were integrated into a single coherent system of awareness and interaction. One night, Elaine allowed herself to immerse fully in the reservoir, tendrils brushing along her skin as waves of vibration carried multidimensional information. She staggered back, breathless, as the patterns unfolded with a richness and density that challenged her understanding. In that moment, she realized she was participating in a dialogue that transcended language, logic, and conventional perception. A direct exchange with intelligence in its purest, most abstract form. In the following days, the entity introduced sequences of increasing complexity. Tendrils extended into nested fractals, smaller orbs traced interwoven helical paths, and pulses of light carried harmonic, temporal, and spatial information. Elaine attempted to mirror, complement, and innovate upon these sequences, and the entity responded in kind, demonstrating reciprocity, adaptation, and awareness. Jonas observed that the human capacity for perception was expanding through this interaction, suggesting that Loch functioned not merely as a location but as a liminal space, a crucible for cognitive evolution mediated by alien intelligence. By the middle of the 10th week, Elaine's perception had evolved to a near-extraordinary degree. She could anticipate tendril movements, detect subtlest variations in pulse frequency and color, and interpret harmonic modulations in the fog and water. Her understanding of spatial temporal patterns, recursion, and abstraction had deepened, allowing her to perceive structures and sequences beyond ordinary human cognition. One night, the entity created a display that seemed almost sentient in its deliberation. Tendrils wove intersecting arches and lattices across the water, smaller orbs traced synchronized orbits, and micropulses vibrated through the fog and into Elaine's very body. She stepped into the reservoir, letting the tendrils brush her arms and shoulders, feeling waves of vibration carrying layered information that was perceptual, cognitive, and abstract all at once. She staggered, exhilarated, aware that she was witnessing intelligence expressed directly, without words, symbols, or conventional logic. Jonas documented the sequences with precision, yet both understood that their records were mere representations of the phenomenon. The true experience existed in perception, engagement, and the transformation of consciousness itself. By the end of the 10th week, Elaine understood a profound truth. Loch was not merely a reservoir, not merely a site for observation, but a living system of awareness, pedagogy, and interaction. Each pulse, tendril, and orbital path was both a lesson and an invitation, challenging them to perceive, understand, and participate in a cognitive framework that transcended human limitations. And within the luminous lattice of light, vibration, and geometry lay truths that could forever transform their understanding of consciousness, perception, and the extraordinary potential that arises when human and alien intelligence intersect in deliberate, patient dialogue. Elaine, immersed in the undulating glow, vibrating with every pulse, recognized that their journey had only just begun, and that the lessons, challenges, and revelations of Loch would continue to unfold in ways that would forever redefine her perception of reality, the universe, and the infinite possibilities of consciousness. By the 11th week at Loch, Elaine felt as though she had become part of the reservoir itself, a participant in a dialogue that spanned perception, consciousness, and reality in ways no human had ever fully experienced. Each night, the fog rose thick and tactile, curling around her and Jonas as if aware of their presence, each movement, each pulse of light, each oscillation of the water a language she could begin to feel rather than merely observe. Jonas Hale, ever vigilant, recorded every nuance with precision, yet he admitted increasingly often that his notes and sketches captured only the skeleton of what was occurring. "We can document the form, the frequency, the paths of tendrils and orbs," he said one evening, voice low with awe. "But the essence, the dialogue, the cognitive exchange is beyond notation. We are participants in perception itself, not merely witnesses." Elaine understood this fully. The main jellyfish-like entity rose from the reservoir in a display more deliberate and profound than ever before. Tendrils extended in arcs and spirals that shimmered in colors she had never seen, hues that vibrated in her perception like music made visible, while smaller orbs traced helical and elliptical paths that intersected, diverged, and recombined in patterns of staggering complexity. She raised her microphone array, projecting a sequence of low-frequency hums designed to interact with these forms. Immediately, the entity responded, tendrils adjusting, orbs altering their orbits, and pulses of light intensifying in a response that was neither mimicry nor reflex but conscious, intentional dialogue. Elaine stepped into the water, allowing the tendrils to brush her arms and shoulders. Vibrations surged through her body, carrying information that was spatial, temporal, abstract, and cognitive simultaneously. She staggered, overwhelmed by the richness of perception, aware that this intelligence was teaching her a language that transcended words, logic, and conventional understanding. In the nights that followed, Elaine experimented with increasingly intricate sequences. She combined gestures, hums, and spatial movements, layering patterns to mirror, complement, and challenge the entity's own displays. The entity responded instantly, adjusting tendrils, modulating pulse frequencies, and improvising orbital paths in ways that suggested comprehension, innovation, and intentional pedagogy. Jonas meticulously recorded each detail, yet he increasingly deferred to Elaine's perception, acknowledging that her intuitive grasp of the dialogue far exceeded what could be captured by charts or notes. The environment itself responded in subtle ways. Fog currents aligned with tendril arcs, water ripples synchronized with orbital paths, and nocturnal creatures moved in coordinated ways, suggesting that Loch had become an integrated network of awareness, a dynamic system in which every element participated in the exchange of information and perception. One night, the entity initiated a display that was unprecedented in complexity. Tendrils extended across the water in overlapping spirals and arches, creating lattices that reflected against the fog in three-dimensional geometries. Smaller orbs traced synchronized ellipses and helical paths, generating structures that were simultaneously architectural, harmonic, and abstract. Elaine responded with a sequence she had been developing over weeks: layered hums, simultaneous gestures, and intricate timing patterns designed to engage the entity's cognitive architecture directly. The response was immediate. The tendrils shifted, the orbs adjusted, and new patterns emerged that suggested both recognition of her input and innovation beyond what she had presented. She felt a profound merging of awareness, a sense that her consciousness and the entity's rhythm were partially entwined, allowing perception of structures, sequences, and information inaccessible through ordinary cognition. Jonas whispered, awed, "Elaine, it's teaching you perception itself. We are witnessing intelligence manifested directly in light, vibration, and spatial temporal structure." In the following nights, Elaine began noticing nested sequences within the larger displays. Micropulses embedded in spirals, recursive patterns in orbital paths, and oscillations in the fog that reflected and refracted the entity's forms. She theorized that these nested patterns were pedagogical, guiding her attention toward higher-order structures, abstraction, and perhaps principles that extended beyond perception into cognition and morality. Elaine experimented with mirroring, inverting, and improvising upon these sequences, observing the entity's adaptations. Each response demonstrated deliberate engagement, suggesting the presence of an intelligence capable of teaching, testing, and expanding human perception. The integration of the environment deepened further. She perceived harmonic vibrations in fog and water, subtle temperature shifts, and behavioral changes in wildlife, all aligning with the luminous displays. Loch had become a living classroom, a crucible of cognitive expansion mediated by an intelligence that orchestrated the reservoir as a unified system of awareness. One particularly transformative night, Elaine allowed herself to immerse fully in the water. Tendrils brushed her skin, waves of vibration carrying multidimensional information that was perceptual, cognitive, and abstract all at once. She staggered, exhilarated, and overwhelmed, sensing principles, sequences, and structures beyond human conception, experiencing intelligence expressed directly through geometry, vibration, and light. In subsequent nights, the entity introduced even greater complexity. Nested fractals, helical orbits, recursive pulses, and shifting lattices challenged Elaine to expand her perception, to integrate multiple layers simultaneously, and to interpret sequences not as symbols but as lived experience. Jonas documented the phenomena meticulously but conceded that his records were mere shadows of the experience itself. By the 11th week, Elaine's perception had evolved to a level bordering on extrahuman. She could anticipate tendril movement, detect subtlest variations in pulse, and sense harmonic modulations within the fog, water, and environment. Her cognition had become multi-layered, recursive, and adaptive, able to perceive structure, abstraction, and intentionality simultaneously. One night, The entity produced a display that seemed almost conscious in its deliberation. Tendrils wove intersecting arches, spirals, and lattices across the reservoir. Smaller orbs traced helical paths that overlapped and diverged in recursive cycles. Micropulses vibrated in the fog and through Elaine's body. She stepped fully into the water, letting the tendrils brush her arms and shoulders, and waves of vibration carried layered information, instruction, and insight. She staggered, exhilarated, understanding that she was experiencing intelligence expressed directly, without words, symbols, or conventional logic. Jonas documented each pulse, path, and variation with precision, but both knew that their recordings were representations, not the phenomenon itself. The true experience existed in engagement, immersion, and the transformation of consciousness. By the end of the 11th week, Elaine recognized a profound truth. Loch was a living system of perception and cognition. Each tendril, pulse, and orbital path was both lesson and invitation, challenging them to perceive, interpret, and participate in a framework of awareness that transcended human limits. And within the luminous lattice of light, vibration, and geometry lay truths that could forever alter understanding of consciousness, perception, and the extraordinary potential unlocked when human and alien intelligence intersected in deliberate, patient dialogue. Elaine, immersed in the undulating glow and vibrating with each pulse, understood that their journey was only beginning, and that the entity, patient and deliberate, awaited the next stage of interaction, ready to reveal insights and challenges beyond anything humans had yet encountered. By the 12th week at Loch, Elaine and Jonas had entered a state of symbiosis with the luminous entity that transcended anything they had known. The nights were no longer merely observation or experimentation. They were immersive experiences, intricate dialogues in which light, vibration, and geometry conveyed lessons, challenges, and revelations beyond the limits of human language. The fog rolled in heavy and tactile, wrapping around them, vibrating with harmonic frequencies that seemed orchestrated by the entity itself. Elaine felt her consciousness expanding with each pulse, each tendril, each orbital pattern, perceiving structures of thought encoded in light and motion rather than words. Jonas, meticulous as ever, recorded every nuance, yet increasingly admitted that the essence of their experience was beyond representation. "We can capture the forms, the frequencies, the orbits," he said one evening, "but not the cognition, not the dialogue itself. That exists in perception, in engagement, in immersion." Elaine understood completely. The main jellyfish-like form rose from the water, its tendrils unfurling in arcs, spirals, and lattices that shimmered in colors impossible to name, while smaller orbs traced synchronized ellipses and helical paths that intersected, diverged, and recombined in patterns of staggering complexity. She raised her microphone array and projected a sequence of harmonics designed to engage the entity directly. Immediately, the tendrils shifted, the orbs adjusted their orbits, and pulses of light intensified in a response that was conscious, deliberate, and profoundly communicative. She stepped into the water, tendrils brushing her arms, shoulders, and face, and waves of vibration surged through her body, conveying information simultaneously perceptual, cognitive, abstract, and emotional. She staggered, exhilarated, aware that she was experiencing intelligence in its purest form, directly, without symbols or language, without translation or mediation. Over the following nights, Elaine and Jonas experimented with increasingly complex interactions. Elaine projected layered hums, precise gestures, and spatial sequences designed to mirror, complement, or challenge the entity's patterns. The entity responded instantly, modulating tendrils, adjusting pulse frequencies, and improvising orbital paths in ways that suggested comprehension, intentionality, and pedagogy. Jonas chronicled every detail meticulously, yet even he knew that these records captured only a shadow of the experience. The environment itself responded. Fog currents mirrored tendril arcs, water ripples synchronized with pulses, and nocturnal wildlife behaved as if aware of the patterns of light above them. Loch had become a living, integrated system of cognition, with human and non-human elements participating in a single network of awareness. One night, the entity produced a display of unparalleled complexity. Tendrils extended across the water in intersecting spirals and arches, forming three-dimensional lattices that reflected in the fog, creating a luminous architecture that seemed simultaneously aesthetic, functional, and instructional. Smaller orbs traced elliptical and helical paths that interwove recursively, producing patterns of staggering abstraction. Elaine responded with a sequence of hums and gestures that pushed the limits of her coordination and perception, layering multiple frequencies, spatial movements, and rhythmic pulses simultaneously. The entity adapted immediately, producing variations that demonstrated recognition, comprehension, and innovation. She felt an almost physical merging of awareness, as if her consciousness had partially entwined with the entity's rhythm, allowing her to perceive structures, sequences, and information beyond human conception. Jonas whispered in awe, "Elaine, it's teaching you perception itself, not just sequences. We are witnessing thought expressed directly through light, vibration, and spatial temporal structure." In subsequent nights, nested patterns emerged within the larger sequences. Micropulses embedded within spirals, recursive orbital paths, subtle oscillations in light and fog. Elaine perceived these as layers of instruction, guiding attention toward higher-order structures, abstract principles, and perhaps ethical or logical frameworks inaccessible through conventional cognition. She experimented with mirroring, inverting, and innovating upon these sequences, observing the entity's responses, which demonstrated deliberate engagement, adaptive understanding, and pedagogical intent. The environmental integration deepened further. Harmonic vibrations, temperature shifts, and subtle wildlife movements all aligned with the luminous displays, forming a living interactive system. Loch was no longer a simple reservoir. It had become a nexus of awareness, a crucible of perception, and a medium through which human consciousness could interface directly with an alien intelligence. One transformative night, Elaine immersed herself fully in the water. Tendrils brushed her skin, and waves of vibration conveyed information in dimensions beyond verbal or symbolic representation. She staggered, exhilarated, and overwhelmed, sensing sequences, structures, and principles that were simultaneously cognitive, abstract, and perceptual. It was intelligence in its purest, unmediated form. In the days that followed, the entity introduced sequences of even greater abstraction and intricacy. Nested fractals, interwoven helices, recursive pulses, and shifting lattices challenged Elaine to perceive multiple layers simultaneously, integrate them, and respond with corresponding sequences. The entity's responses demonstrated reciprocity, awareness, and even innovation, as if teaching by example and inviting her to extend her perceptual capacity further. Jonas continued to document meticulously but acknowledged that his records were mere representations. True comprehension existed only in engagement, immersion, and the transformation of consciousness itself. By the 11th night of the 12th week, Elaine's perceptual capacity had evolved beyond ordinary human limits. She could anticipate tendril movement, detect microvariations in pulses, and sense harmonic modulations across the fog, water, and surrounding environment. Her understanding of spatial-temporal relationships, abstraction, and intentionality had reached a level that allowed direct perception of principles, structures, and sequences previously unimaginable. That night, the entity created a display that seemed consciously designed for culmination. Tendrils wove intersecting arches and lattices across the reservoir, smaller orbs traced interwoven helical paths, and micropulses radiated through the fog and water, reaching into Elaine's consciousness. She stepped into the water, letting tendrils brush her arms and shoulders, and waves of vibration transmitted information simultaneously perceptual, cognitive, and abstract. She staggered, exhilarated, fully aware that she was witnessing intelligence expressed directly, unmediated, and complete in its abstraction. Jonas recorded every pulse and path, yet both knew that the record could never convey the experience itself. The true phenomenon existed in the dialogue of perception, attention, and engagement. As the luminous display reached its climax, Elaine perceived a profound truth. Loch was not merely a reservoir, not merely a location for observation, but a living system of cognition, pedagogy, and resonance. Every tendril, every pulse, every orbital path carried lessons and invitations, challenging human perception, cognition, and intuition. Within the undulating lattice of light, vibration, and geometry lay insights that could forever transform understanding of consciousness, reality, and the potential unlocked when human and alien intelligence engaged deliberately in dialogue. Elaine, immersed in the glow, vibrating with every pulse, understood that their journey was not only about observation or comprehension, it was about transformation. Loch, the entity, the fog, the water, and even the wildlife formed a unified network in which consciousness could expand, adapt, and interface with a reality far richer and more complex than previously conceivable. In the silence that followed, as tendrils retracted and orbs descended into gentle spirals, Elaine felt a profound serenity. The entity's final pulses that night conveyed a sense of completion, yet not conclusion. A patient promise that the dialogue, the lessons, and the expansion of perception would continue, awaiting their readiness. She looked at Jonas, both aware that they had crossed thresholds no human had crossed before, and that Loch had revealed truths about intelligence, awareness, and the infinite possibilities of perception that would remain with them forever. The fog lifted slowly, reflecting the first rays of dawn on the water's surface. Elaine and Jonas remained in silence, absorbed in the afterimage of pulses, spirals, and lattices, understanding that the reservoir, the entity, and the nights themselves had become a crucible of transformation, where consciousness expanded, perception deepened, and the extraordinary potential of human understanding was revealed in dialogue with an intelligence entirely alien, yet profoundly coherent. And somewhere within the luminous lattice, in the gentle pulsing of tendrils and the rhythm of orbiting orbs, lay the promise of continued discovery, connection, and insight, a patient, deliberate invitation to explore the boundaries of consciousness, reality, and the astonishing possibilities that unfolded when humans learned to perceive and engage with intelligence beyond their world.